is an old Korean saying that a person is not fully born until they have lived long enough to disappoint themselves at least once. Maybe you know that feeling. The younger version of you had a plan. And somewhere along the way, life handed you something else. Tonight, wherever you are in that journey, whether you feel like you are still becoming, or wondering if you ever will, this is for you. Before we begin, a quick question for the community. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening right now, and what time it is. There is something quietly beautiful about knowing that someone in London and someone in Sydney and someone lying awake at 3 in the morning in a Texas bedroom are all resting inside the same stories tonight. If these journeys find you at a good moment, the subscribe button is right there. It costs nothing and keeps this little sanctuary in your feed. Now, close your eyes if you are ready. These stories come from 10 centuries and 6 traditions, Korean mountain hermits who sat alone in stone cells until they stopped being afraid of themselves, Chinese Chan masters who taught entire lifetimes of wisdom in a single gesture, Tibetan teachers who walked toward death the way most of us walk toward breakfast, and ordinary men and women from the forests of Thailand and the river valleys of Vietnam who discovered that what they had been searching for was never very far away. This video offers contemplative stories inspired by Buddhist wisdom created for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply a place to breathe. So breathe now. Feel where your body meets the surface beneath you. Notice the specific weight of this moment, not heavy, just real. The ceiling above you, the quiet, the fact that you made it to tonight. Whatever this day asked of you, it is finished now. The stories are waiting. He had memorized 10,000 pages of scripture, and it had not saved a single life. That is where this story begins, not at the moment of enlightenment, but in the long, humbling darkness that came before it. In the autumn of 1879, in the central mountain province of Chungcheongdo in Korea, a young monk named Gyong-ho was walking the road south toward Seoul when the sky opened without warning. Rain swept down in grey curtains across the rice paddies, flattening the late-season stalks, turning the dirt road to mud that sucked at his sandals with each heavy step. He was 30 years old. He had been teaching Buddhist scripture at Dong-haksa Temple, the East Crane Temple, named for the White Crane rock formation on its eastern hillside, and he had become, in the world of Korean Buddhism, something of a prodigy. Young monks came from distant provinces simply to sit in the same hall as him. Senior elders invited him to lecture at regional assemblies. He had mastered texts that other monks spent entire careers approaching only partially, and he explained them with a clarity that made difficult ideas suddenly feel obvious to his listeners. He was, by every visible measure, a man well on his way to becoming great. He did not feel like one. That is perhaps the first thing to understand about Gyong-ho, and the first thing in this story that may feel quietly familiar to you. He was accomplished, and he was empty. He was admired, and he was alone with a question no amount of admiration could answer. The question was not complicated. It was, in fact, the simplest question a human being can face. If I have learned so much, why do I not yet know how to live? He had grown up inside the walls of temples since the age of 9, when his widowed mother had brought him to Cheonggyesa Monastery in the hills above Yueyang, a small town south of Seoul. His father had died when Gyong-ho was young, not dramatically, not memorably, just gone one season in the way that fathers sometimes went in the late Joseon period. between one harvest and the next. His mother, a small and practical woman who made her living by sewing silk linings into the robes of magistrates' wives, had decided that the monastery was the safest place for a bright, restless boy with no money and no family connections. She had been right. Gyong-ho had taken to it immediately the early mornings. The smell of incense and pine smoke, the rhythmic order of bells marking the hours. He had a mind that absorbed language the way dry earth absorbs rain. And within a few years he was advancing through texts that novices twice his age could barely pass. By 14, he had been sent to study under the great lecturer Manhwa at Donghaksa, in the mountains of Gyeongsan. By his mid-20s, he was the one doing the teaching. He walked through the rain now, with all of that behind him. His robes were soaked through to the skin. His sandals had long since stopped protecting his feet from the cold. The mountains of Chungcheongdo rose and fell around him in the dying afternoon light, dark ridgelines softened by low cloud. The sound of water running everywhere, in ditches and over stones and down the faces of cut earth where the road had been carved from the hillside. He was thinking, as he often did while walking, about a passage from the Lankavatara Sutra he had been preparing to teach the following month. Something about the nature of mind, something he understood intellectually and could explain with precision and had never, not even once, actually touched with his life. He smelled the village before he saw it. There was something wrong in the smell, not the ordinary smoke of cooking fires, not the animal warmth of oxen in their evening stalls, not the sour earthen scent of kimchi crocks buried in rows along south-facing walls. Something sweeter and darker under all of that. He came around a bend in the road, and the first low-roofed farmhouses appeared through the rain, mud-walled, their thatched roofs darkened with moisture, paper windows unlit in every doorway. He stepped through the gate of the nearest house and called out. Nothing. He pushed the inner door open. The family had died 3 days before, the father still seated against the interior wall as though he had simply decided to remain there. The mother near the clay cooking pit, one hand resting on its rim. The 2 children on their sleeping mat, with faces turned toward each other. Cholera moved through the late Joseon countryside with a speed that left no time for flight. It arrived without announcement, killed within hours or days depending on the person's strength, and moved on before anyone in the next valley knew to close their gates. Gyong-ho stood in the doorway for a long time. The rain tapped steadily on the thatched roof above him. The lamp oil had long since burned out. He was aware of his own breathing in a way he had never been before, aware of it as a thing that was happening, that could stop, that would stop, that the absence of which was everywhere in this room. He went to the next house. The same. The next village along the road, a kilometer further through the dark. The same. Farmers and grandmothers and children and a young couple who had been married, by the look of their still festive bedding, perhaps only a season ago. People who had known the name of every stone on these paths, who had planted and harvested these specific terraced fields for decades, who had argued about water rights and celebrated their children's first steps and grown old inside these particular walls, and who were now simply absent from the world, as completely as if they had never been in it. Gyong-ho sat down in the mud in the middle of the road. He sat there for a long time. The rain continued. The mountains around him were invisible now, dissolved into the dark. And in that mud, in that cold, something happened that he had not expected. He realized that nothing he knew could touch this moment. 10,000 pages. The Avatamsaka Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, The Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, the transmission of the lamp, the recorded sayings of masters stretching back 500 years. He could locate any passage, explain any doctrine, draw the lineage charts from Bodhidharma to the present moment. And sitting in that mud with the rain on his face, he knew none of it. Not one word of it reached down to where he was. Not one phrase of scripture made those people less gone, or told him what they had been, or told him what he was, or told him what any of this brief, extinguishable, irreplaceable flickering of being alive actually meant. He walked back to Donghaksa Temple in the dark. The following morning, he gathered his students in the main hall. He told them he had nothing to teach them. Not because Buddhism was wrong, he said, but because he himself had not yet touched it. He had been reading a menu and describing the dishes to hungry people without ever having eaten. He dismissed them all. He locked himself in a small room at the back of the meditation hall and hung a piece of paper on the door on which he had written, "A matter of life and death, do not disturb me." And there he sat, for 8 years. The room was small enough that he could touch both walls by spreading his arms. It held a single oil lamp, a thin sleeping mat that he rarely used, and a low wooden desk on which he kept a single text, not one of the great sutras, but a collection of old Seon exchanges, spare and strange and full of phrases that refused to yield to logic. The Huadu he worked with, the questioning phrase his practice turned on, came from a Chinese master named Ling Yun, "Even though I should become a cow, there will be no nostrils." He did not know what it meant. He held it not as a riddle to be decoded with intelligence, but as a stone he pressed against the center of his thinking, an obstruction, a thing that would not dissolve no matter how many times he turned it over. His days had a simple architecture. He rose before dawn when the moktak drum sounded through the temple corridors, the hollow, the resonant knock of the wooden fish drum, a sound he had heard every morning of his life since age 9. He washed his face with cold water from the stone basin in the courtyard. He ate a small bowl of rice porridge with pickled radish and a few dried persimmons. He returned to his room. He sat. The lamp burned low. He added oil. He sat again. A younger monk brought his midday meal on a wooden tray and left without speaking. He ate. He sat. Evening came. He slept a few hours on the mat. He rose again. Winters were hardest. The stone floor of the room held the cold the way granite holds cold deeply, structurally, up as though the cold lived inside it rather than merely touching its surface. Frost formed on the interior walls of the room in patterns that were almost beautiful, thin, crystalline branching like white ferns. He wore his heaviest robe and wrapped his legs in a rough cotton blanket and continued to sit. His feet, pressed against the cold floor, went numb by mid-morning and stayed that way until he forced himself to walk the narrow corridor outside his room for 30 minutes in the afternoon. Sometimes he could hear snow falling, that particular muffled silence that snowfall brings, the way the world's ambient sounds decrease by half, as though a door has been gently closed. He found that silence bearable in ways he had not expected. Springs were stranger. The cherry trees outside the meditation hall flowered and fell, as they do in the mountains of Korea. Over the course of perhaps 10 days, vivid beyond reason one morning, and then a steady, soft snowfall of petals, pink going to white, covering the stone paths and the tops of the stone lanterns and the surface of the small carp pond near the kitchen. He barely saw them. He was always inside, always turned inward toward the same rough stone of his Huadu. The same question that had no answer and therefore could not be finished. He was not achieving anything. He understood this clearly and found it oddly steadying. Occasionally he emerged to give a teaching the monastery needed him, and he could not in conscience refuse entirely. He would sit before a group of monks and speak for an hour about impermanence or the nature of mind, and the monks would look at him with that particular focused reverence that young practitioners give to teachers they believe have what they themselves are seeking. He wanted to tell them, "I have nothing you do not already have. I am searching in the same dark you are." But he said the words that were useful and returned to his room. His face changed over those years. Photographs do not exist from that period, but his disciples who knew him in his later years described the face of the younger Gyong-ho smooth, round, open, and the face of the elder one, angular, watchful, with a quality in the eyes they consistently struggled to name. Not serenity exactly, not certainty. Something more like a man who had stopped performing a self and had not yet found what remained, but who had made a kind of peace with not finding it yet. It was on the 15th day of the 11th month of his 8th year, a full moon night in the early Korean winter. The mountain air sharp and perfectly clear. The pine trees on the ridge behind the temple showing black against a sky that was almost luminous, that he was sitting with his lamp burning low, reading by its small light. He was not reading with any sense that this evening would be different from the 10,000 evenings before it. He read the Wadu. He read it again. He had read it more times than he could count. And then something happened. It was not like a door opening. It was more like a knot releasing. Something that had been held perhaps since the rainy road, held perhaps since he was 9 years old, and his mother brought him to the monastery walls and left him there. Held perhaps longer than that. Held in the way. All of us hold something we have forgotten. We are holding simply let go. And in the space of that release, he saw something he had been looking for his entire adult life. Not a new thing. The oldest thing. The thing that had been present in the mud and the rain and the silent village and the 10,000 pages and the cold floor and the full moon and every single ordinary moment of the 8 years in that room, present in all of it, unchanged by any of it, and not something he had earned, not something he had finally understood, something that had never, not for a single instant, been absent. He laughed out loud in the empty room. A real laugh, surprised, unguarded, the laugh of a man who has just noticed the obvious thing that was always there. He wrote a poem that night. Its closing lines, translated into English, read simply, "I was suddenly aware that the universe is my home." He spent the rest of his life wandering. He founded meditation centers across Korea, at Sudaeksa Temple in the hills of South Chungcheong Province, at Beomeosa near the southern coast, at the great forest monastery of Hainsa in the Gyeosan Mountains, where the Tripitaka Koreana, 80,000 carved wooden printing blocks containing the entire Buddhist canon, had been preserved for 7 centuries. He taught hundreds of disciples, some of whom became the living masters who shaped Korean Seon Buddhism well into the 20th century, establishing the Jogi order that remains the heart of Korean Buddhism to this day. And then, in 1905, at the age of 56, he did something that bewildered everyone who knew him. He stopped being Gyong-ho. He let his hair grow long, which was unthinkable for a monk. He left his robes. He gave himself the name Nanju Park, an unremarkable name, the name of an ordinary man, and walked north into the countryside, where he wandered from village to village, teaching Confucian classics to the children of farmers, sleeping wherever someone offered a mat, eating whatever was offered, carrying nothing. He died in 1912 somewhere in the northern province of Hamgyong-do, in circumstances so ordinary that no one thought to note them carefully. The greatest Korean Seon master of the modern era died as an unknown wanderer, and perhaps that was exactly as he intended. The final teaching was the life itself. That wisdom, when it arrives fully, does not ask for a stage. There is a feeling that many of us carry quietly into the night, the feeling that we are not yet the person we imagined we would become by now. That somewhere along the way we were supposed to arrive at something, some settled, certain, clear-eyed version of ourselves, and it has not happened. We are still uncertain, still caught by old worries, still surprised by our own reactions, still asking the same questions we were asking 20 years ago, wondering whether something is fundamentally wrong with us, whether everyone else has understood something we have missed. Gyong-ho sat in the mud at 30, having mastered 10,000 pages, and felt nothing but cold rain and the weight of not knowing. The mud was not a failure. The mud was the beginning of the real work, because what the 8 years in that small room eventually gave him, not as a conclusion, not as a prize, but as a slowly lived understanding, unglamorous and patient, was this: wisdom is not something you accumulate. It is something you gradually stop obscuring. The scripture was not wrong. The years of learning were not wasted, but they had been layered, one atop the next, like beautiful textiles piled so deeply they buried the floor beneath them. And the floor had always been there. The ground of the thing had never not been there. You may have spent years building your own version of those 10,000 pages, decades of experience, of trying, of failing in the ways that teach you things success cannot. Years of wondering whether you were becoming wiser or merely older. Years of feeling, in quiet moments, that the real clarity was just around the next corner, that if you survived the next difficulty, or had the right conversation, or understood one more important thing, something would finally settle. What if it is already settled? What if the mud and the rain and the years of sitting with questions that refused to answer were not keeping you from your wiser self, but were, slowly and without announcement, building it? Gyong-ho did not become wise by finally getting something right. He became wise by stopping the war against his own not knowing. By sitting with the question long enough that the question itself became a kind of home. By accepting that the universe, his universe, with all its cold floors and unanswered huadus and empty villages and full moons, was, in fact, Om. Let your breath soften now. Feel the weight of the blanket, or the pillow, or whatever surface holds you in this moment. You don't need to have arrived anywhere to rest here. You don't need a clearer mind, or a calmer heart, or a more resolved sense of who you are. You are already, in ways you may not be able to see from where you stand tonight, the elder you have been becoming. Just this breath, just this moment, just this. And as that recognition begins to settle, as the chest softens around it, as the body remembers that it already knows how to rest, we travel now from the mountains of Korea to the river valleys of a different Asia, a different century, a different kind of wisdom. A story of a man who was handed everything the world calls success, and what he discovered, late one ordinary afternoon, that all of it had missed. His name meant feeder of the helpless, and he had spent his entire life living up to it. Sudatta was born in the merchant city of Savatthi, in the ancient kingdom of Kosala, in northern India, sometime in the 5th century before the Common Era. His family were traders in cloth, in grain, in the thousand goods that moved along the river roads of the subcontinent, and from his earliest boyhood he understood commerce the way other children understand play. He understood the weight of things, the value of transport, the way a good reputation traveled faster than any cart. He was quick with numbers and slower to anger than most men in his profession, and both qualities served him well. By the time he was 40, he was the wealthiest merchant in Savatthi, perhaps in all of Kosala. His warehouses lined the southern quarter of the city. His trading caravans, long strings of oxen and covered carts, traveled roads as far east as Rajagaha and as far south as the great river plains. Where the monsoon rains came so heavily, the roads turned briefly to rivers. He employed hundreds of people, fed his workers' families, kept accounts in 7 languages, and was known throughout the merchant districts of 3 kingdoms by a name that was not the name his parents had given him. People called him Anatha Pindika, the one who gives food to the unprotected. He had earned this name not by any single dramatic act of generosity, but by a lifetime of small ones, accumulating the way water accumulates in a stone bowl quietly, without fanfare, until one day you notice the bowl is full and has been full for a long time. He kept a guest house attached to his compound, where wandering monks and destitute travelers could sleep without payment and eat without obligation. He gave work to men that other merchants refused, those who had lost everything in floods, those who carried names considered inauspicious in a superstitious age, those whose castes made other employers turn them away at the gate. He had a childhood friend named Kala, whose circumstances had become so reduced that men would not acknowledge him in the market. Anatha Pindika found Kala a position in his household accounts and treated him with the same formal courtesy he extended to his most senior partners. And this single act of dignified kindness followed Kala for the rest of his life, like a lamp someone had handed him in the dark. He met the Buddha on a business trip to Rajagaha, sometime in the middle of his life. He had gone to visit his brother-in-law, another wealthy merchant, and found him in a state of unusual excitement, preparing an elaborate feast for a group of monks and their teacher. The atmosphere of the household was transformed. The servants were hurrying with an energy that suggested neither wedding nor royal visit, but something Anatha Pindika could not immediately name. He asked his brother-in-law what was happening. His brother-in-law said, "The Blessed One is coming." Anatha Pindika rose before dawn that morning to walk to the Sitavana forest outside the city, where the Buddha was staying. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine, and the stars were still visible on the western horizon as he walked the forest path alone. He found the Buddha walking slowly in the pre-dawn darkness, not pacing, not exercising, but moving with the measured deliberateness of someone who inhabits each moment of walking as fully as he inhabits sitting. And the teacher turned, greeted him by name, and invited him to sit. They talked until the light changed. What they discussed, the texts do not record in detail. What they record is the effect. Anatha Pindika walked out of that forest a different man. Not visibly different, he still had the same merchant's broad shoulders, the same quick eyes that calculated distance and value as naturally as other men breathe. But something in him had settled that had previously been restless, and he understood, though he could not yet fully articulate it, that he had spent his entire life approaching something he had only now, in this forest, on this morning, actually touched. He returned to Savatthi, determined to bring the Buddha there. He searched for suitable land, somewhere accessible to the townspeople, but peaceful enough for monks, and found it in the park of Prince Jeta, the son of King Pasenadi of Kosala. The prince was resistant and named an outrageous price: fill the park with gold coins. He said, "Cover every square cubit of ground with them, and it is yours." Anatha Pindika, without hesitation, began ordering the coins brought from his treasury. The story says that he covered all but a small corner of the park before his gold ran out, and that Prince Jeta, moved by a generosity so literal and unhesitating, it stopped his breath, donated the remaining land himself, along with timber for a gate and walls. Together, they built what became known as Jetavana, Jeta's Grove, the great monastery that the Buddha would return to year after year across the remaining decades of his teaching life. The place where most of his recorded teachings were given. Anatha Pindika spent 5 years' worth of what the texts estimate as 54 billion units of value, an almost incomprehensible sum on that monastery and its maintenance. He provided robes, medicine, food, and shelter not only for the Buddha and the senior monks, but for the hundreds of practitioners who came and went through Jetavana across the decades. He visited 3 times a day when the Buddha was in residence, bringing offerings in the morning, midday, and evening. And he never came empty-handed because he knew the young monks and novices would look for what he had brought. And he did not want them to see empty hands where they expected generosity. And then, in the way that life arranges its most important lessons, he lost almost everything. It happened gradually, then completely. A flash flood swept away 18 million pieces of his fortune goods warehoused along the riverbank, destroyed in a single rainy season afternoon. Business partners, to whom he had lent equivalent sums over the years, men he had trusted without demanding collateral because trust was the currency in which he had always preferred to trade, found themselves unable to repay him and did not try. His fortune, which had seemed limitless, turned out to have limits. He continued giving what he could thin rice gruel for the monks instead of the elaborate meals he had once served. A mat instead of a proper room for travelers, but the scale of everything had diminished. A spirit that had lived in the 7-story gate tower of his compound, following the laws of its realm, obliged to leave whenever people of great spiritual merit entered the house, appeared to him one night and suggested, with the pragmatic logic of the spirit world, that he stop feeding monks. The generosity was bankrupting him. He was poor now. No one would blame him for stopping. Anatha Pindika looked at the spirit for a long moment. He said, "I know only 3 treasures, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. I am giving my life to those treasures. You have no business in a house that lives this way. Get out." The spirit left. The years passed. He grew old in the way that men who have spent their lives in purposeful effort grow old, not with regret, exactly. Not with the specific bitterness of someone who feels they chose wrongly, but with a deepening awareness of how much the body costs to maintain in its later seasons. His joints ached in the monsoon months. His eyesight, which had once read fine calligraphy across a room, now required the lamp to be brought very close. He slept less but more deeply, and when he woke in the grey pre-dawn hours, he would lie still for a while and feel the particular quality of silence that old age brings, a silence different from the silence of youth, fuller somehow, less anxious, as though time has finally agreed to slow down enough to be inhabited. It was during his final illness, when he was confined to his bed and the household moved quietly around him with the specific attentiveness that surrounds a dying person, that the monk Sariputta came to visit. Sariputta was the Buddha's chief disciple, the one the texts describe as foremost in wisdom, a man whose understanding of the Dhamma was so precise it was said that even the Buddha occasionally deferred to his analysis. He sat beside Anatha Pindika's bed in the late afternoon light, the room smelling of sandalwood and warm cotton, and the particular closeness of an interior space where someone has been lying still for many days. Sariputta asked, "How is the feeling in the body?" Anatha Pindika said, not well. The pain is increasing rather than decreasing. Sariputta was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me ask you something else. In this moment, is the eye clinging to visual forms? Is the ear clinging to sounds? Is the mind clinging to its own formations?" Anatha Pindika considered this carefully, not as a theological question to be debated, but as a real inquiry into what was actually happening inside him right now. He noticed something. The eye was seeing the ceiling above his bed, the texture of the clay plaster, a small water stain in the shape of nothing in particular. The ear was hearing the servant's feet on the stone floor outside the door, the birds settling in the courtyard mango trees for the evening, the distant sound of the city, and somewhere underneath the pain in the body, the mind was watching all of it, not grasping, not reaching toward anything, not pushing anything away, just watching with a kind of neutral, interested clarity that he recognized, suddenly, had always been available and which he had spent most of his life too busy to notice. He said, "I think the mind is not clinging right now." Sariputta said, "Then that is where to rest." They sat together in the afternoon light while the sounds of the city came through the window and the pain continued in the body, and the mind watched it all with that quiet, unclenching awareness. After some time, Sariputta said, "Everything you have given has prepared the ground for exactly this moment. All those mornings at the grove, all those bowls of gruel when there was nothing else, all those years of treating the helpless as though they were your equals, which, in truth, they were. None of it was separate from what you are experiencing right now. The giving was the practice. The practice was the giving. And both of them led here, to this bed, to this afternoon, to this mind that has learned, through decades of open hands, how to hold nothing." Anatha Pindika wept. Not from grief, or not only from grief, but from the shock of recognition that sometimes arrives very late, when you have been living a truth for so long that you forgot it was a truth and started to think it was just your life. He died that night, in the city he had fed for 40 years, with his hands open. The Pali texts record that he was reborn in the Tusita heaven, one of the realms of joy, and that he came briefly back, in that first night after his passing, to stand at the edge of Jetavana and say a few words to the monks who were sitting in the gathering dark. The words were simple. "The grove is beautiful. The Sangha is established. The Dhamma endures. I have no regrets." Then he was gone. There is a particular pain that comes from giving, not the pain of sacrifice, that is something different, more dramatic, easier in some ways to understand. The pain that comes from giving is subtler. It is the pain of not knowing whether it was enough, whether the bowls of rice gruel, when the gold was gone, were enough, whether the years of open-handedness made any real difference to the world they touched, whether a life spent in service, not dramatic service, not the service of battles or revolutions, but the ordinary daily service of feeding and sheltering and treating people with dignity, whether all of that amounted to something that mattered. This is not a young person's question. Young people worry about whether they are doing the right things. The question that comes with age is quieter and more personal. Did the life I actually lived mean what I hoped it would mean? Anatha Pindika lay on his bed in the afternoon light and asked that question without words. And Sariputta sat beside him and offered, not an answer, but something better, a direction to look. Not outward at the accounting of acts and their consequences, not backward at the long history of giving and receiving and losing, inward at the mind that was present right now, in this room, in this body, in this moment of pain and evening light and birdsong through the window. Is anything clinging? No. Then this is wisdom. And wisdom was there, in that mind, because 40 years of open hands had taught it how to open. The life you have lived has taught your mind things that your mind does not have words for yet. Every year of showing up, of giving what you had, of treating people as though they were worth treating well, of continuing to act from decency, even when decency was expensive, all of that was practice. It was preparing this mind, your mind, for exactly this, for the capacity to lie still, or to lie awake at 3 in the morning, and feel the room around you and not need it to be otherwise. You don't need to have been generous on the scale of Anatha Pindika. You don't need to have built a monastery. The open hands can be small ones. They can be the hand that kept its patience when patience was difficult. The hand that wrote the message it didn't have to write. The hand that stayed when leaving would have been easier. All of it is the same practice. All of it is opening. Let your hands soften now, wherever they are resting. Feel the palms open slightly against the sheets or the blanket, as though releasing something you have been carrying without knowing you were carrying it. You have given enough. You have done enough. You are, right now, in this body, in this room, exactly enough. Rest into that. Let the breath carry it deeper than thought can reach. And as the hands soften, and the breath slows, and the mind settles into the particular quality of stillness that comes when a life long lived finally agrees to set down its accounts. We move now from the plains of ancient India to the mountain forests of China, to a story about a man who thought wisdom was something he could get from the outside in, and what the mountain eventually taught him instead. The young monk had been polishing the floor tile for 3 days before his teacher finally spoke. His name was Dao Yi, and he was 20 years old, newly arrived at the mountain monastery of Nanyue in Hunan province, in the south of China, in the 8th century of the Common Era. The Tang dynasty was at its height, then a cosmopolitan, brilliant, sometimes brutal civilization that stretched from the Korean border to the edges of Persia, and whose capital, Chang'an, was the largest and most sophisticated city on earth. Poets competed for imperial favor. Merchants moved silk and porcelain and gold along roads that reached farther than any army had yet gone. And in the great monasteries tucked into the mountain ranges that fell away from the Yellow River plains, monks sat in meditation halls that smelled of pine resin and cold stone and tried to discover what lay underneath the noise of an enormously busy world. Dao Yi had walked to Nanyue from his home province of Sichuan, a journey of several weeks through country that shifted from the red basin farmlands of the west, terraced with rice paddies and dotted with farmhouses whose curved roofs swept upward at the eaves like birds about to take flight, through the narrowing river gorges of the central mountains, and finally into the green, mist-hung ridges of Hunan. He had been ordained as a monk at 20, had studied with several teachers in Sichuan without finding what he was looking for, though he could not, if pressed, have told you precisely what that was, and had heard, through the networks of traveling monks and itinerant teachers that functioned as the informal communication system of Tang Dynasty Buddhism, that a master named Nanyue Huairang was teaching something different. Not more sophisticated doctrines, not better methods of textual analysis, something that could not quite be described, which was, he suspected, precisely the point. When he arrived, Nanyue Huairang was sitting in the courtyard of the monastery in a patch of morning sunlight, mending a sandal. He was a compact, unremarkable-looking man in his mid-50s, with large, dry hands and the particular quality of stillness that some people develop after decades of sitting practice, not the stillness of someone suppressing movement, but the stillness of someone who has stopped needing to move in ways that don't serve a purpose. He looked up at the young monk from Sichuan, assessed him in a way that felt neither warm nor cold, and said, "What are you here for?" Dao Yi said, "I am here to study the Buddha Dharma and attain enlightenment." Nanyue Huairang looked at him for another moment. Then he went back to mending the sandal. Dao Yi was assigned a cell in the dormitory wing, given the schedule of monastery life rising before dawn, morning chanting, work duties, meals in the hall where monks ate in silence with straight backs and careful movements, afternoon meditation, evening teaching, sleep, and he settled in. He was, by the standards of young monks, extraordinarily disciplined. He sat meditation with a focus that senior practitioners noticed and approved of. He learned the monastery's routine quickly and kept it precisely. He asked intelligent questions of the older monks and listened carefully to the answers. Everything about him suggested a person who understood what was being asked and was doing it correctly. And yet, something was wrong. He felt it himself, a tightness in the practice, a quality of effort that felt slightly off, the way a door feels off when it is swollen in the frame and requires force to open. Meditation was not the problem. He could sit for hours. The problem was what he was doing while he sat. He was reaching, constantly, beneath the surface of whatever technique he was applying. There was a hand extended outward in the dark, grasping for something that kept receding. Enlightenment, whatever that was, felt like a destination that kept repositioning itself just beyond the next effort, the next sesshin, the next breakthrough. One morning, he found a smooth, flat stone in the courtyard, a river stone, grey-green, worn perfectly oval by water, cool and dense in the palm, and on an impulse he could not quite explain. He began rubbing it against the flagstone floor of the meditation hall. Methodically, steadily, with the same focused intention he brought to his sitting practice. He was still rubbing it on the third morning when Nanyue Huairang walked past, glanced down at what he was doing, and stopped. "What are you doing?" the master asked. "Polishing this stone," Dao Yi said. "To make a mirror." Nanyue Huairang crouched down beside him, looked at the stone and the floor and the fine powder of grit that had accumulated from the friction. He said, "How long will you polish it?" Dao Yi said, "As long as it takes." The master picked up the stone, turned it in his large, dry hands, set it back down. He said, "No amount of polishing will make this stone a mirror. A stone cannot become a mirror by being rubbed. That is not what stones do." Dao Yi opened his mouth to say something and stopped, because he heard, suddenly, what the master was not saying directly but was making unmistakably present, that what he was doing with the stone was exactly what he was doing in his meditation. He was taking something that was already complete, already whole, already itself, and applying effort to it in the belief that the effort would transform it into something it was not yet but needed to become. He was polishing a mind that did not require polishing. He was reaching for something that he was already standing inside. He sat back on his heels. Nanyue Huairang watched him for a moment. Then he said something that Dao Yi would spend the rest of his long life, he lived to 79, teaching at his own monastery in Jiangxi province for the final 3 decades, trying to say in every possible way to every student who came to him, if you go about searching for the way externally, the more you search, the further away it grows. Give up trying to grasp the world with your mind. Striving with your mind is the root of suffering. Just keep from striving, and you will be able to remove all suffering." Then the master went inside. Dao Yi sat in the courtyard for a long time with the river stone in his hand, feeling the weight of it against his palm, feeling the cool stone floor through the thin fabric of his robe, hearing the morning birds in the pine trees on the ridge above the monastery, smelling the smoke of the breakfast fire beginning in the kitchen. All ordinary things, all completely present, all requiring nothing from him, no reaching, no effort, no becoming something other than what he was. He understood, not as an idea, as a direct recognition of something that had been there continuously, hidden only by the habit of looking past it. The title he eventually became known by was Mazu Ancestor Ma, and he founded what historians call the Hongzhou school of Chan, which became one of the most influential streams of Chinese Buddhism in the Tang dynasty, producing generations of masters who shaped the tradition for centuries. But what he taught, in every possible variation, for the remaining 59 years of his life, was this single thing his teacher had shown him in a courtyard with a river stone. Ordinary mind is the way, not exceptional mind, not enlightened mind, not the mind you will have after you have practiced enough, suffered enough, understood enough. This mind, the one reading these words, or rather hearing them, or rather drifting slightly as they reach you, this ordinary, unremarkable, not yet arrived, still questioning, sometimes worried and sometimes simply tired mind. This is it. He developed a distinctive teaching style across those decades. He was large and physically imposing. The Tang records describe him as walking like a bull and glancing around like a tiger, but his teaching was characterized less by dramatic gestures than by a precision that could be disarming in its simplicity. When students came to him with elaborate philosophical questions, he often responded with something so plain it felt initially like evasion. A student asked him once, "What is Buddha?" He said, "This mind is Buddha." The same student came back later and asked, "But how do I find this mind?" Mazu looked at him for a moment and said, "You are already using it to ask the question." The student stood there. There was nothing to do with that answer except receive it. Another student came to him in genuine distress, a young monk who had been practicing for 5 years with great seriousness, and whose face carried the haggard, slightly hollow look of someone who has been trying extremely hard for a long time without arriving anywhere. He stood in front of Mazu and said, "I have been practicing every day. I sit for hours. I keep the precepts. I have read everything I can find. Why am I not enlightened?" Mazu was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you are hungry, do you eat?" The student said, "Yes." "When you are tired, do you sleep?" "Yes." "Then you are practicing." The student's face did not immediately change, but something in his posture shifted, a slight release in the shoulders, a fractional softening around the eyes. As though a weight he had been carrying without knowing he was carrying, it had been quietly acknowledged and set down. This is the core of what Mazu taught, and it is perhaps the most radical thing the Chinese Chan tradition produced in its golden age, more radical, in some ways, than the iconoclasm or the shouting or the paradoxical questions. The suggestion that the mind that suffers is the same mind that is already free, and that what creates the suffering is not the mind itself, but the habit of reaching past it. The habit of treating the present state of awareness as insufficient, as a preliminary, as a condition that must be improved before anything real can begin. We learn this habit very young. We learn it so early and practice it so thoroughly that by adulthood it runs beneath everything, below the level of conscious decision. The mind generates a thought. and immediately evaluates it good or bad, useful or useless, evidence of progress or evidence of failure. The body feels something: discomfort, tiredness, the low-grade unease of a difficult week, and the mind immediately begins negotiating with it, pushing it away or planning how to resolve it. Even pleasure and ease, when they arrive, are shadowed by the anticipatory sense that they will end, and the reaching begins again in advance of the ending. The Buddhists call this pattern the second arrow. The first arrow is whatever difficult thing has actually happened. The second arrow is the mind's judgment of and reaction to the first arrow, and unlike the first, the second arrow is optional. Mazu did not teach that nothing matters. He did not teach that effort is pointless, or that the careful cultivation of wisdom and compassion is unnecessary. He taught something more precise, that the reaching itself, the constant effortful grasping after a better version of this moment, is not the path to wisdom, but the primary obstacle to it. That the mind which reaches past itself is never actually present in the moment it is reaching from. That wisdom is not located in the destination. It is what you are made of right now, this very instant. This ordinary, unremarkable moment of hearing these words in the dark. There is a pattern that many of us recognize, once we have lived long enough to see it in ourselves. It runs something like this: when I have finished this difficult period, then I will be able to rest. When the children are grown, when the debt is cleared, when the project is complete, when the health improves, when the relationship resolves one way or the other, then I will arrive somewhere I can actually inhabit. The reaching is so constant and so habitual that it feels like forward motion. But Mazu's stone tells us something about that motion. You can polish something indefinitely and never change what it actually is. You are not a project to be completed. You are not a stone that requires polishing into a mirror. You are already what you are looking for, and have been continuously through every year of reaching. Feel that now, if you can, not as an idea, but as a direct noticing. Is this breath reaching for something? Is this moment straining toward the next? Or is it simply here, present, complete, unremarkable, sufficient? Just this ordinary moment, just this ordinary mind that has been the way all along, polishing nothing, needing nothing, already arrived. Let your breath do what it does. Let the body rest where it is. And as the reaching softens, as the hand that was always grasping for something loosens, just slightly, around what it was holding, we travel now from the mountains of Tang Dynasty, China, eastward and forward in time, to the forests of medieval Japan, where a young man climbed a mountain in the wrong season for entirely the wrong reasons, and what an old gardener showed him about the mind that sees what it chooses to see. The incense smoke rose and did not wait. That is what the boy remembered. His mother had been alive that morning, or he believed she had, because no one had told him otherwise. And in the way of 7-year-olds, he had assumed that all mornings were continuous with each other, that what was alive yesterday would be alive today, that the world was essentially stable and his place within it was secure. Then the afternoon happened, and then the evening. And then he was standing in a room full of monks and relatives and the soft percussion of wooden drums, and a stick of incense was burning before a wooden tablet that bore his mother's name, and the smoke went upward in a single thread that bent slightly in a draft he could not feel, and then dissolved into the ceiling without asking anyone's permission. He watched it go. He was 12 years old, the texts sometimes say 7, and the grief shaped him either way, and his name was Dogen, and he would spend the next 40 years of his life trying to say in every possible way to every person who would listen. What that smoke had shown him in the space of its rising, that things go, that the going is not the tragedy, that the tragedy, if there is one, lies in the mind that could not let them go, the mind that loved the flower and so experienced its falling as a wound, that disliked the weed and so experienced its growing as an affront. Not the flower, not the weed, the love and the dislike, the preference that the mind imposes on a world that has no interest in preferences. He entered the monastery at Mount Hiei, the great Tendai center north of Kyoto, while still a child. He stayed there for years, studying the elaborate ritual traditions and doctrinal systems of the Tendai school, which was then the dominant form of Japanese Buddhism, a sophisticated, hierarchically organized tradition that had produced many of Japan's finest scholars. He learned well. He was, by all accounts, remarkably quick and deeply serious in a way that distinguished him from other young monks, who were serious in the performing of seriousness way that youth tends toward. Dogen's seriousness was different. It had an interior quality, as though he were always attending to something slightly below the surface of whatever he was being asked to study. The question that drove him, the one the incense smoke had planted in him without warning at his mother's funeral, was this: if all beings are already endowed with Buddha nature, as the sutras teach, why is practice necessary at all? Why sit in meditation? Why observe the precepts? Why do anything, if what you are looking for is already what you are? He could not find a satisfying answer at Mount Hiei, not because the teachers there were inadequate, many were extraordinary, but because the question was not the kind that yields to textual analysis. It was a living question, the kind that requires a living encounter to answer. He left for China in 1223 CE, on a wooden ship that crossed the East China Sea in conditions that would have been terrifying by any standard weeks of open water. Grey swells, the smell of salt and timber and the bilge, and arrived at the Song dynasty port of Mingzhou in Zhejiang province. He was 23 years old, still a young monk by any measure, and he had crossed an ocean to find an answer that he suspected, though he could not yet confirm, had been available to him all along. He found it not in a monastery but on a dock. The ship had barely anchored when a cook from a nearby Chan monastery, an old man with a sun-darkened face and hands, calloused from decades of cutting and stirring, came to the harbor to buy shiitake mushrooms for the summer solstice meal his community would share. He was perhaps 65, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has been doing exactly this for a very long time. Dogen, still on the ship, leaned over the railing and called down to him, and they fell into conversation about the harbor, about the mushrooms, about what the young Japanese monk had come to China looking for. The old cook listened to Dogen's question. He turned a mushroom over in his hands, examining it with the particular attention a cook gives to an ingredient he is about to trust with his reputation. Then he looked up and said, "You have crossed the sea to find what you already brought with you." Dogen said, "I don't understand." The cook said, "Come back when you do." He bought his mushrooms and walked back up the dock without looking around. Dogen spent 2 years traveling between monasteries before he found a teacher who could show him, in the living texture of transmitted practice rather than words, what the old cook on the dock had meant. His teacher was Tiantong Rujing at the great monastery of Tiantong, high in the mountains of Zhejiang, where the mist rarely fully cleared, even in summer, and the pine trees on the ridges above the monastery were perpetually veiled in white. Rujing was a demanding teacher of the Kagyu school, what would become in Japan the Soto tradition, and he emphasized above everything else the practice of shikantaza, just sitting. Not sitting towards something, not sitting in order to achieve an experience, Just this, the body upright, the breath natural, the attention present without object. Nothing to get, nothing to become. Dogen received Dharma transmission from Rujing in 1227 and sailed home to Japan, carrying, as the texts describe it, an empty hand. No scriptures, no relics, no written transmission of secret teaching, just the direct experience of what sitting is when it stops being a vehicle for arriving somewhere else. He settled, eventually, in the mountains of Ekizen province, the rugged, forested coastline of what is now Fukui Prefecture, on the Japan Sea side of Honshu, and built Eiheiji, the Temple of Eternal Peace, in 1244, in his 44th year. The monastery sat deep in a cedar forest, at the end of a valley where a cold mountain stream ran steadily over grey stones. In winter, the snow came in quantities that seemed intent on erasing everything man-made, burying the wooden corridors and stone garden paths under a white that required constant work simply to keep the monastery functional. The monks shoveled in shifts. They split firewood. They hauled water from the stream when the pipes froze, which they did every winter, reliably, without apology. He found the Japanese mountain country beautiful in a way that he spent years trying to articulate without quite arriving at the right words. Not beautiful as a painting is beautiful distanced, framed, available for appreciation. Beautiful in the way a living thing is beautiful, participating, present, as much a part of the looker as of the landscape. He wrote, in the Genjo Koan, the essay that many scholars consider the heart of his entire collected works, this line that has stayed in the tradition for 8 centuries, flowers fall even though we love them, weeds grow even though we dislike them. He was writing about the mind, specifically about the gap between what the mind prefers and what actually happens, and how that gap is the primary source of ordinary human suffering. Not the falling of the flower, not the growing of the weed. The preference, the expectation that the world should arrange itself according to the mind's liking, and the chronic, low-grade disappointment that follows when it does not. He had a student at Eiheiji, an older monk named Tetsugen, who had come to the monastery in his late 50s after many years in the world. He had been a merchant in Kyoto, importing lacquerware from craftsmen in the northern provinces, and had been moderately successful, moderately married, moderately content in the way that people are, who have arranged their lives into workable shape without ever quite asking whether the shape is the right one. His wife had died. His children were grown. He had sold the business to a younger partner and walked away from the city with the distinct sense of a man who has just realized he spent 30 years furnishing a house he never actually intended to live in. He arrived at Eiheiji in the early spring, when the cedar forest was beginning to release the compressed scent of its winter, a cold green smell, resinous and deep, and the stream below the monastery ran high and fast with snowmelt. Dogen met him in the abbot's room, a small, spare space with a single calligraphy scroll on the wall and a view through the paper screen of a section of garden where raked gravel met 2 stones and a winter bare plum tree. They sat together. Dogen asked what had brought him. Tetsugen said, "I have spent my life trying to make things be what I wanted them to be. I am tired of that. I want to stop." Dogen was quiet for a moment. Outside, a pair of crows landed in the plum tree, shifted on the branches, flew away. The screen brightened and dimmed as a cloud crossed the morning sun. He said, "You cannot stop what you want, but you can stop believing that what you want should determine what is." Tetsugen did not immediately understand. He sat with it for months through the spring planting, through the summer session, through the autumn harvest, through the first heavy snows that buried the lower walkways and turned the monastery into an island in white. He shoveled when it was time to shovel. He sat when it was time to sit. He ate the monastery's simple food: rice, miso, pickled vegetables, occasional tofu without complaint and without particular enjoyment, which was itself a kind of practice. He was not trying to enjoy it and not trying not to. He was simply eating. One evening, in his second winter at Iheiji, he was walking the covered corridor between the meditation hall and the kitchen, carrying a lantern, when the wind that funneled down the valley from the ridge, a clean, cold, the steady wind that smelled of cedar and distant snow, came through the gap in the wall where the corridor turned at a right angle, and the lantern flame bent almost horizontal and then straightened, and the corridor was briefly full of shadows going in every direction. He stopped. He stood there with the lantern in his hand. Something shifted. Not dramatically, not the way the Rinzai accounts describe sudden enlightenment, the crack of thunder, the moment of vertigo and laughter. More quietly than that, more like a membrane thinning rather than breaking. He saw, in the lantern light and the moving shadows and the smell of cedar and snow, that the corridor was not beautiful because it matched some picture in his mind of what a monastery corridor should look like on a winter evening. It was beautiful because it was exactly what it was: this cedar wood, this cold wind, this bending flame, this moment, unrepeatable, asking nothing of him. The beauty was not in his appreciation of it. It was in the thing itself, prior to any appreciation, prior to any preference, prior to the mind's decision about whether to love it or resist it. The flowers fall, the weeds grow, the wind bends the flame. None of it waits for the mind's judgment. He understood, finally, what Dogen had been saying all along. There is a pattern the mind runs, so habitual it is almost impossible to catch in the act. Something happens, a conversation, a change in health, a relationship shifting, an ordinary Tuesday afternoon going sideways, and before the experience has fully arrived, the mind has already judged it. Good or bad, welcome or unwelcome, the kind of thing that should happen or the kind that shouldn't. The judgment is faster than thought. It precedes thinking. And the moment the judgment lands, the experience splits, what is and what the mind believes should be. And in that gap, without exception, is where suffering lives. This is not a small thing to notice, because the pattern is so constant, so ambient, so woven into the texture of ordinary consciousness, that most of us reach late life without ever seeing it clearly. We have simply lived with it. The way you live, with the sound of traffic outside a window in a city so continuously present that it has become the background against which everything else happens, and you cannot imagine what silence would sound like. Dogen is asking you to listen for that silence. Not by stopping your preferences. You cannot stop preferring things. The mind prefers. The way the flower falls. That is its nature. But you can begin not all at once, not perfectly, but in this moment, in this quiet, to notice the gap between the preference and the judgment. To feel the wind on the flame without immediately deciding whether it should have blown. To experience the weed growing without treating that growth as a personal verdict on the quality of your gardening. The flowers will fall. They will fall whether you love them or not, whether you fight it or accept it, whether your body is tense or soft as you watch it happen. They will fall at their own time. The falling is not about you. Let the breath be what it is. Let the body be where it is. Let this moment fall where it must, without helping it. And as that understanding settles, not as a thought, but as a slight releasing of the jaw, a slight widening of the chest, we travel now from the mountain monasteries of medieval Japan west and south, across the water, to the river valleys of Vietnam, to a story about a king who became a monk and what he learned late in his life. From the way a lotus lives in mud without asking the mud to be anything other than what it is. He had won 2 wars and a kingdom, and none of it had quieted the thing inside him that would not be still. His name at birth was Tran Nhan, and he had come into the world on a December morning in 1258 inches, the royal palace of Dai Viet, the great Vietnamese kingdom that occupied the northern and central portions of what is now Vietnam, with a complexion so luminously golden that the court attendants called him Kim Tien Dong Tu, the golden, immortal child. This was not merely flattery. The Tran kings were known for their physical presence, their directness, their capacity to move between the world of statecraft and the world of contemplation without losing either a quality that the Vietnamese called nup the, entering the world, as distinguished from a withdrawal from it. The Tran court was Buddhist in a way that was genuinely integrated into governance rather than ceremonially attached to it. The kings meditated. They discussed Dharma with senior monks. They tried, with varying degrees of success, to apply Buddhist principles to the difficult business of ruling a country surrounded by powerful and occasionally hostile neighbors. Trần Khâm became King Trân Nhan Tong in 1278. At the age of 21, he had been raised in the palace on the Red River Delta, a landscape of extraordinary flatness. The river spreading across its alluvial plain in wide brown braids, the rice paddies stretching to every horizon under skies that alternated between the white haze of dry season and the dramatic vertical architecture of monsoon cloud. The palace was built of the wood of southern hardwoods, lacquered and painted in the colors that the Tran dynasty favored: deep red, black, flashes of gold, and smelled of incense and river water, and the slightly sweet decay that all wooden buildings accumulate in a tropical climate. He had grown up in that smell. He knew every corridor, every garden, every angle of light, through every window, at every hour of the day. He was studious in a way that surprised the court scholars who had expected a prince to require coaxing toward his lessons. He read the Buddhist sutras without being asked. He studied the records of previous dynasties, not simply to understand the political landscape, but because he was genuinely curious about how other people had navigated the large questions that kept arriving, unannounced, in his own interior. What is this life for? What endures? What is it that I am? Underneath the accident of being born in a palace instead of a rice paddy, he had a teacher named Tuet Trung Thuong Si, a remarkable figure who was simultaneously a senior official in the Tran court and a deeply realized Zen practitioner, moving between the world of politics and the world of practice with the ease of a man who had discovered that the two were not as separate as they appeared. Tuet Trung taught the young prince a phrase that stayed with him for the rest of his life. There is no Buddha in the mountains. Buddha is right in the heart. A quiet heart that knows that is the true Buddha. He was 15 when he first heard it. He was still working out what it meant when he was 40. The Mongols came first. They came twice. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan had already subjugated China and Korea and was pressing southward into Southeast Asia, and Dai feet stood in the path. The first major invasion came in 1285, a force that the Vietnamese chronicles describe as several 100,000 soldiers moving south through the mountain passes. A number that may have been exaggerated, but that conveyed accurately enough the quality of the threat. The young king found himself, at 27, facing the largest military power in the world, with an army a fraction of its size and a kingdom that had no meaningful strategic depth if the northern defenses failed. He did not fail. He fought with what later historians would call a combination of strategic brilliance and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in people who had every reason to despair. He knew the rivers, the monsoon, the particular ways that jungle terrain could be made to swallow an army accustomed to open steppe. He used retreat as strategy rather than defeat, drawing the Mongols deep into territory that was lethally unfamiliar to them. Waiting for heat and disease, and the cutting of supply lines to do the work that direct engagement would have cost too dearly. The Mongols were turned back. They came again in 1288. They were turned back again. After the second victory, he stood in the throne hall of the restored capital and received the honors that a king receives after preserving his kingdom. The court was brilliant with silk and music and the formal expressions of gratitude. He accepted it all with appropriate gravity and felt, in the precise center of that moment of triumph, the same unanswered question that had been with him since boyhood, a quiet heart that knows. He did not yet have it. He ruled for another 6 years before abdicating in 1293. He gave the throne to his son Tran Nhan Tong and spent the following years advising the court, settling the border territories, arranging the political landscape in ways that would give the next generation the best possible chance. He was thorough about this. He did not leave in haste or in a burst of spiritual excitement. He prepared the departure as carefully as he had prepared the defense of the kingdom, understanding that what he was doing next required that the world he was leaving behind to be in order. In the 10th month of 1299, in the year of the pig, at the age of 41, he walked out of the palace for the last time and turned north toward the mountains. Yen Tu Mountain rose from the coastal plains of what is now Quang Ninh Province, north of the Red River Delta, its ridgelines disappearing into the perpetual mist that gathered around its upper elevations. It was not the tallest mountain in Dai Phaet, but it had been sacred to Vietnamese Buddhists for generations, a place where monks had settled into hermitages cut from the granite, where the distance from ordinary life was measured not only in elevation, but in the quality of silence. The sound of the delta, the constant human sound of a kingdom going about its business, buying and selling, governing and being governed, eating and sleeping and arguing and mourning, that sound fell away completely, somewhere around the 800-meter line. And what replaced it was wind through bamboo and pine, and water on stone, and occasionally the long, resonant cry of a bird whose name he did not know. He had been told that 100 of the women of the court, his concubines, his attendant, the women whose lives had been organized around his presence for 2 decades, had followed him from the palace and up the mountain road. He stopped at a stream called Giai Oan, the stream of solved grievances, and turned to face them. They were tired and determined, their court silks already muddy from the mountain path, their faces showing the particular expression of people who have decided something important and are not yet certain whether they have decided correctly. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "Go home. Start your lives again. What I am going to is not for company. What I am going to is not for comfort. It is for something I have been trying to find my whole life, and which I can only find alone." Some wept. Some argued. Eventually, all of them turned back down the mountain, and he continued up, He stopped at the stream called Sui Tum, the bathing brook, and washed the last of the palace from his skin in its cold mountain water. He stopped at a small shelter near the stream and ate his first meal as a monk, plain rice cooked in brook water with vegetables gathered from the forest edge, with no sauce, no ceremony, no servants to bring the bowl and take it away. He sat with the bowl in both hands, in the posture he had practiced since boyhood, and ate slowly and completely, and was, for the first time in many years, not doing anything else simultaneously. He built his practice at Hoa Yen Pagoda, at 800 meters above the valley floor, where a strip of relatively flat ground allowed a modest hall and garden. The forest around it was dense and various bamboo in the lower elevations, giving way to ancient pine at the higher, the understory full of ferns and the small flowers that bloom in mountain shade without any audience. In the mornings, mist moved through the trees in long drifting scarves that obscured and revealed the mountain's shapes. In the afternoons, if the weather was clear, he could see south toward the coast and the wide water of the Gulf of Tonkin catching afternoon light in a sheet of hammered silver. He meditated in the early mornings. He received students who came to learn. He walked the mountain paths in the late afternoon and paid attention. Which is to say, he simply looked at what was in front of him without needing it to be anything other than what it was. The lotus had always been the central image of Vietnamese Buddhism, the flower that rises from mud, its petals clean and perfect, regardless of the darkness of the water it grew through. He had loved the image since childhood, the way children love symbols before they understand them. Now, living on the mountain and watching the seasons move through the forest, the monsoon rains in summer, the mountain chill in winter that was so unlike anything he had felt on the delta, he began to understand it differently. The lotus does not struggle with the mud. The lotus does not apologize for the mud, or try to elevate itself above the mud's influence, or wait until the mud becomes something cleaner before deciding to grow. The lotus grows through the mud, using the mud, rooted in what the mud provides its nutrients, its stability, its thick holding, and produces, from exactly that darkness, the thing of greatest beauty. Not despite the mud, through it. He had spent his reign trying to separate the spiritual life from the life of governing, to protect one from the other, to keep what was pure in one compartment and what was difficult in another. What the mountain was teaching him, slowly and without words, was that this separation had never been necessary and had never actually existed. The two wars, the grief, the weight of decisions made with insufficient information, the people he could not protect despite trying, the compromises that governance requires, all of it was mud. All of it was the ground in which the lotus had always been growing. None of it had contaminated the quiet heart that knows. It had, in fact, been the very medium in which that heart had been growing toward the light. He wrote a poem in his years on the mountain, the central text of what would become the Truk Lam school, the bamboo forest school, named for the groves that covered the mountain's lower slopes, their hollow stalks speaking in the wind with a sound like percussion, like the gentle knocking of the wooden moktak drum in a meditation hall. The poem described what he was discovering, that to live in the world and enjoy the way is not a contradiction, that the way is not elsewhere, that the mud is not the obstacle, that what you have been through has not kept you from wisdom. It has been, all along, the ground in which your wisdom grows. He died in 1308, on the peak of Yen Tu, at the Ngoa Van Hermitage, the reclining cloud, in his 50th year. The texts say that he passed in the early morning hours, in the posture of sitting practice, with the sound of wind in the pines and the first light beginning on the eastern horizon over the Gulf of Tonkin. His disciples built a stupa for his relics at the Hu Kwang Tower, which still stands on the mountain, surrounded by 97 smaller stupas housing the remains of the monks who came after him. Every spring, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese pilgrims climb the stone steps of Yen Tu Mountain. They begin before dawn, moving through the bamboo forest by lantern light, stopping at each pagoda along the path that traces the route the king-turned-monk first walked in 1299. It is one of the largest pilgrimage movements in all of Southeast Asia. They are not, most of them, monks or scholars. They are shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, parents, grandparents, people who have lived in the world the way all of us live in the world, with mud on their hands and questions in their hearts, and the enduring hope that what they have been through has not disqualified them from the thing they are looking for. They climb because Tran Nhan Tong showed them that it has not. There is a particular form of suffering that comes from believing that your life, as it has actually been lived, is the wrong material for wisdom, that the difficulties were mistakes, that the compromises disqualified you, that someone else, someone who had not lost what you have lost, had not done what you have done, you had not lived in the specific mud of your specific life, would have been better positioned to find peace, that you are, in some fundamental way, too ordinary, too complicated, too stained by the ordinary staining of a human life to arrive at what the teachers are pointing at. Tran Nhan Tong fought 2 wars and governed a kingdom for 15 years and ordered decisions that caused suffering and made choices he could not always defend and loved people he could not always protect, and was, by the time he walked up that mountain path, the specific accumulation of every single thing he had been through, and he sat at 800 meters above the valley floor in the mist and the pine smell and the rain, and he discovered that none of it had separated him from what he had always been carrying. The quiet heart that knows, present through all of it, present now. Let your breath soften. Feel the particular weight of your particular life, not as evidence against you, but as the ground in which something has been growing all along, without your needing to manage it, without your needing to be other than you have been. The mud is not the problem. The mud is what the lotus grows through. The mud is, in fact, what makes the lotus possible. Feel your shoulders release. Feel the chest open slightly on the next exhale. Nothing to fix. Nothing to correct. Nothing to become. If sleep comes now, let it. You don't need to stay awake to receive what this mountain has always been offering. And as the breath slows and the body settles into the night, as the weight of the world releases a little, the way mud releases what it has been holding, when the season finally shifts, we travel now from the peaks of Vietnam north and west to the high, wind-cold altitudes of Tibet, where a student walked 12 days through snow to ask a teacher one question. And the teacher answered it with something unexpected, and the student understood, for the first time, what it means to be free. He had walked for 12 days through snow to ask one question, and the question dissolved before he could ask it. His name was Zu Nam Rinchen, and he was 28 years old in the winter of 1107 CE, when he first heard the name Milarepa spoken aloud in a monastery courtyard in central Tibet. He had been circumambulating a stone stupa in the grey morning cold. His monk's robe pulled tight against the wind that swept down from the plateau with the indifference of something that has been moving for a very long time and is not planning to stop. The stupa was older than the monastery itself, and its whitewashed stone caught the weak winter light with a faint luminescence. He moved clockwise around it, the way the teachings prescribed, not thinking especially, simply walking in the rhythm that 7 years of monastic life had made second nature. He heard the beggars before he saw them. 3 men, thin and windburned, the kind of men who moved between the settlements of the Tibetan plateau, following whatever availability existed: food, shelter, small acts of charity, with the patient resignation of people who have stopped expecting things to be different. One was complaining about hunger in the specific, detailed way of someone who has been thinking of little else. Another shushed him. A monk was nearby. He said, "Besides, there were people in Tibet who suffered far worse and said nothing at all." Did he not know about the yogi called Milarepa, a man who lived alone in the mountain caves above the snow line of the Lapchi range, wearing only a single cotton robe in the deepest winter, subsisting on nothing but nettles boiled in glacier water, sitting in meditation from before dawn until after dark, year after year, in conditions that would kill an ordinary person inside a week, and who had, through all of it, arrived at something that the 3 of them could not adequately describe, only name. He had become, the beggar said with a reverence that sat oddly on a man arguing about food, free. Sonam Rinchen stopped walking. Something moved through his chest at that word, not a thought, but a physical event. A warmth that arrived as suddenly as a hand placed over the heart. He stood still in the cold for a moment, aware of his own heartbeat. Then he walked to the beggars and asked where to find this man. They told him, north and west, in the caves above the Kirong Valley, in the Lapchi Mountains, where the peaks exceeded 6,000 meters and the air was thin enough that ordinary breathing required a conscious attention it did not usually need. 12 days in good conditions. Longer now. In winter. He listened to all of this carefully. He thanked them. He went back to his cell and began packing. He was, by any measure, an exceptional practitioner already. He had not always been a monk. Before the monastery, before the grief that had made the ordinary life impossible, he had been a physician trained in the 3 medical traditions of Tibet, India, and China, moving between settlements, treating fevers and broken bones and difficult births and the long, slow illnesses that come to people in their later years. He had been good at it. He had possessed the particular quality that distinguishes a good physician from a merely competent one, the capacity to sit with suffering without flinching, to be present with a person in their worst moment without the presence becoming about the physician's own discomfort. He had a wife. He had an infant child. They died within the same season, the wife of a fever that moved too quickly for any of his training to arrest. The child shortly after. In the specific grief collapse that sometimes follows the loss of a mother, he sat with both of them at the end with the same stillness he brought to his patients. Then he sat alone for a long time. In the house that had been full of people and was now simply a structure of wood and clay and the smell of medicine and the absence of the 2 people who had made it matter. He entered the monastery 6 months later. He did not enter it in desperation, seeking distraction. He entered it because something in the teachings which he had studied informally all his life, as most educated Tibetans did, had suddenly acquired a quality of urgency it had not previously possessed. Death was not an abstraction. He had watched it arrive twice in one season in the faces of people he loved. The teachings addressed this directly. They pointed at something underneath the arriving and leaving, something that the arriving and leaving could not touch. He wanted to know if that was true, not conceptually. In the way the cold was true, and the grief was true as direct experience, not philosophy. He mastered the Kadampa curriculum with a speed that startled the senior monks. He sat in meditation for hours with the quality of attention of someone who has discovered, late in life, that this is the only thing that matters. His teachers recognized his gifts and were glad of him and worried for him simultaneously, in the way good teachers worry about exceptional students, sensing both the capacity and the specific danger that exceptional capacity tends to carry. The danger of becoming attached to one's own achievements, of mistaking the map for the territory, of arriving at a sophisticated understanding of the path without ever stepping fully onto it. He packed a small bundle, a thick blanket, dried barley flour pressed into traveling cakes, a water skin, his begging bowl. He told his teachers he was going to find Milarepa. One teacher tried to dissuade him. The route was dangerous in winter, the conditions extreme, and besides, what could this cave-dwelling yogi offer that the monastery could not? Sonam Rinchen listened with his characteristic patience. He said he understood the concern. He went anyway. The first 3 days of walking were cold but passable. The route crossing the open high grassland where the wind arrived from the northwest with the clean, empty smell of nothing, no trees, no villages, nothing between it and him for 100 kilometers. He walked steadily, sleeping in whatever shelter presented itself, the ruins of a summer herding station the first night, a granite overhang the second, a farmer's outbuilding the third, where a woman brought him tsampa, roasted barley flour mixed with the thick, salt-flavored butter tea that is the primary caloric medium of Tibetan plateau life without asking his name or his destination. She simply saw a monk and brought food. He ate it gratefully. On the 4th day, the route began climbing. The cold changed character. On the plateau, it spread itself thin across vast distances, diluted by space. In the mountains, it concentrated, pressed in on all sides, found every small gap in clothing with a precision that felt deliberate. Snow began on the 5th day, not a storm, but a steady, unhurried accumulation that covered the path and required him to find the route by the shape of the terrain rather than any visible track. He moved more slowly. He chanted under his breath, not as technique, but as company. The familiar rhythms of the texts he had memorized over 7 years, filling the silence of the mountain the way the sound of a stream fills a forest. On the 8th day, he lost the path entirely on a snow traverse above a drop he did not look down into. He found it again by moving laterally along the ridge until the terrain below him opened back into a valley he could descend. On the 10th day, he came to a frozen stream that had to be crossed on ice that groaned under his weight with the sound of something enormous, slowly deciding whether to yield. He crossed quickly and did not stop until he was on solid ground again, breathing hard in the thin air. On the 11th day, he found a shepherd at the floor of a hanging valley who told him, with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had given these directions before, exactly where Milarepa's cave was. He found him on the 12th day, in a cave above a boulder field, sitting in its mouth, facing the morning sun, with the specific stillness of someone who has been sitting this way for a very long time and has stopped requiring reasons to continue. Milarepa was wearing one cotton robe. The temperature was several degrees below freezing. His body appeared unmoved by this in a way that Sonam Rinchen recognized immediately as not the numbness of exposure, but the genuine metabolic mastery of Tumo, the inner heat practice of the Kagyu tradition, which trained the subtle body to generate warmth independently of external conditions. His face had been clarified by decades of practice in the way that extreme cold clarifies water, by removing everything that is not essential and leaving what remains luminous. His eyes were attentive and absolutely still. Sonam Rinchen prostrated 3 times in the snow. Milarepa watched him without particular expression. Then he said, "Stand up, monk." "What do you want?" Sonam Rinchen had prepared his question across 12 days of walking. He had refined it, stripped it of what seemed unnecessary, turned it over from every angle. The question, in its final form, was, how do I become free? Standing in the snow in front of that cave, looking at the man inside it, he found he could not say the words, not because he forgot them, because something in Milarepa's stillness made the question feel suddenly like the wrong shape for what he was actually asking. The question assumed that freedom was a destination, something he did not have and needed to acquire by means of the right instruction, the right practice, the right sequence of events properly followed. And looking at Milarepa sitting in the cave entrance in the freezing light, wearing one robe, with nothing visible in the cave behind him, beyond a small fire of dried yak dung and a clay pot, no texts, no cushions, no shrine objects, nothing that suggested accumulated possession of any kind, Sonam Rinchen felt with unusual clarity that he was looking at a person who was not lacking what he was searching for, and that the difference between them was not what Milarepa had acquired. It was what he had stopped carrying. Milarepa made tea. The tea was thin and slightly bitter, and tasted, in that moment, like the most restorative thing he had ever swallowed. They sat together in the cave mouth, while the morning light moved slowly across the boulder field below. Over the following 13 months, Sonam Rinchen lived near Milarepa's cave. He practiced Tummo for most of that first year, the inner heat practice that begins with the physical experience of warmth and eventually opens into something larger, an understanding of the body as not a fixed container, but a dynamic process in which the boundary between inside and outside is far more permeable than ordinary experience suggests. He sat for hours each day in conditions that would have been impossible without the practice. He ate very little. He slept briefly. He stopped noticing weather as comfortable or uncomfortable and began simply inhabiting it as the texture of this particular form of existence. He had one conversation with Milarepa that he would later identify as the pivotal moment of his entire practice life. He had gone to the teacher in genuine distress. For several weeks he had been sitting in a state of overwhelming bliss and clarity, a quality of meditation so vivid and transparent and joyful that he had been certain, with the certainty of direct experience rather than inference, that he had arrived somewhere permanently, that this was enlightenment. And then, over the course of several days, as quietly as it had come, it faded. The quality of mind that had seemed limitless contracted back to something ordinary. He sat in the same cave, in the same posture, doing the same practice, and the light was simply gone. He was devastated in a way that surprised him by its depth. He had not expected to mind so much. He had thought of himself as someone not particularly attached to pleasant experience. Losing this showed him how wrong that had been. He went to Milarepa and said, "I found it and I lost it. How do I hold it?" Milarepa looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You are attached to your meditation experience. This attachment is a greater obstacle than any bad meditation. The experience arose because conditions were present. It faded because conditions changed. This is the nature of everything that arises. The freedom you are looking for does not arise and does not fade. It is not a state. It is what is present when you stop running toward what arises and running from what fades. You cannot hold it because it is not something to be held. It is what remains when the holding stops. Sonam Rinchen sat with this for 3 weeks without speaking much. Something in him was working through what he had heard, the way the body works through a cold, not by thinking about it but by letting it move through him at its own pace. He began to understand that he had spent his entire practice life, even his medical life, before that oriented toward a future state. A state of clarity that would be stable, a condition of understanding that would not come and go. He had been, without knowing it, trying to nail down something that was by its nature fluid. And every time the state arose and felt promising, the clinging to it was precisely what prevented it from deepening into something more fundamental. The meditation experiences were real, but they were not freedom. They were, at best, windows. And he had been trying to live in the window frame rather than looking through. The day came in spring, the snow retreating from the lower boulder field. The first small alpine flowers opening in the rock cracks with the perfect indifference of things that bloom exactly when conditions allow and do not bloom when conditions do not. When Milarepa told him it was time to go back to central Tibet, to study further, to teach, he was ready. He packed his few belongings. He said goodbye to the other students. He went to take leave of Milarepa, and they walked together down the path toward the valley. Milarepa moved slowly with a walking stick, the morning air carrying the smell of snowmelt and mud and the particular clean emptiness of high altitude in early spring. When they reached the stone bridge across the glacial river, Milarepa stopped. He said, "Let us not cross together. Put down your load. Let us talk here, father and son." One final time. They sat beside the river on flat stones. The water ran clear and fast over grey granite, the sound of it continuous and entirely indifferent to their conversation, which was itself a teaching. "If you were listening," Milarepa took his hand. He said, quietly and without ceremony, "Stay free of pride and self-centeredness. Cut the bonds of affection and attachment." Then he placed his feet briefly on the crown of Sonam Rinchen's head, the gesture of final transmission in the Kagyu lineage. The teacher's realization passing through the physical contact as directly as heat passes through copper, and he said, "I have given you everything. Now go. Be happy." Sonam Rinchen crossed the stone bridge and walked east. He had gone perhaps 200 meters, far enough that the old teacher's figure had become small against the mountain behind him. When he heard Milarepa calling his name, he turned. The yogi was waving him back. He crossed the bridge again, puzzled and glad. Milarepa looked at him with those entirely still eyes and said, "Who else but you deserves to receive this most precious quintessential instruction? Come here." Sonam Rinchen stepped close. Milarepa stood, turned around, and hoisted the back of his robe. His buttocks were covered with calluses thick, ridged, hardened like the hooves of an animal from decades of sitting on bare stone without a cushion. He said, "There is no more profound teaching than this. This is how realization comes. Not from having the right view, not from the right teacher or the right transmission or the right moment of bliss arising. From sitting, from practicing until the body itself becomes the record of your commitment. From continuing when nothing seems to be happening. From letting go of the need for the practice to feel like it is working." He put his robe down. He turned and looked at Sonam Rinchen and said nothing else. Sonam Rinchen stood in the cold spring air looking at his teacher and felt something in him release, not dramatically, not with any of the quality of a breakthrough or an opening or any of the language that practitioners use to describe exceptional moments. Quietly, the way a hand releases something it has been holding for so long, that the releasing itself feels strange, and then immediately natural, and then immediately like the only possible thing. He saw that the freedom he had walked 12 days through snow to ask about was not on the other side of any further effort. It was on the other side of the part of him that kept treating effort as a ladder to somewhere else. It was available precisely where he stood, with calluses that had not yet fully formed, and a practice that was not yet complete, and a mind that was still capable of being devastated by the loss of a beautiful meditation experience available in all of that. Through all of that, not despite it, he crossed the stone bridge for the last time. He did not look back. He became Gampopa, the physician from Dakpo, the foremost student of Milarepa, the man who synthesized the careful, scholarly path of the Kadampa tradition with the radical, the direct practice of the Kagyu yogi lineage into something that could be transmitted to monks and lay practitioners alike without losing the living fire at its center. He founded the monastery of Dakla Gampo in central Tibet in 1121 CE. He wrote the jewel ornament of liberation still studied, still living, in Tibetan monasteries across Asia and the world, a text that begins not with doctrine, but with this recognition, that you already possess Buddha nature, and that you are therefore not a project to be completed, but a field in which something is already growing. Not when you have practiced enough, not when your understanding is finally clear. Now, as you are, in this exact, complicated, not yet resolved life, there is a particular suffering that comes from waiting, not the suffering of acute difficulty that has its own quality, its own demands, its own methods. The suffering that comes from waiting is subtler, and it runs through more of ordinary life than we usually admit. Waiting to feel more settled before allowing yourself to rest. Waiting to understand more before trusting what you already know. Waiting to be further along, calmer, clearer, more arrived before giving yourself permission to inhabit the life you are actually living rather than the one you imagine you should be living by now. Gampopa waited. For 13 months in those high, cold mountains, he waited for the stable, unlosable experience of clarity to return and stay. And Milarepa showed him not with a teaching about non-attachment, but with the physical fact of his own calloused, committed, unglamorous body that the waiting itself was the obstacle. That freedom was not waiting at the end of the process. It was present in the process, available in each moment, that the grip loosened even slightly on the idea that this moment is insufficient. This is a letting go that happens not once but continuously. Not a dramatic release but a practice of small releases. To repeat it. The hand loosening again and again around the stone, it keeps picking up the stone of not yet. The stone of when things are different. The stone of after I have finally understood. Each time the hand loosens, something breathes. Something that has been compressed and tight opens fractionally. Nothing dramatic. Just this. And then this. And then this. Let your hands open slightly now, wherever they are resting. Feel the palms ease. Feel the jaw soften. Feel the breath arrive and leave without your help, the way it always has, the way it was doing before you started trying to manage it. There is nothing to hold. There is nothing to become. There is this body, and this breath, and this moment of the night opening into its quieter hours, and that is enough. That has always been enough. The calluses are the teaching, and the calluses are already there, earned by every difficult thing you have continued through without guarantee of outcome. Just this, just here, just the weight of the blanket, the sound of the dark, the breath moving of its own accord, Sleep is welcome. You have already arrived. And as the breath slows and the body grows heavier and the mind releases its last careful hold on wakefulness, we travel now from the high cold of Tibet down through the passes and the lowering altitudes, through the monsoon forests, to the still forest clearings of northern Thailand, to an old teacher who sat under the same tree for 30 years and who discovered, in that long, unhurried stillness, that the sky does not struggle with the clouds that move through it, and that this was the most important thing he had ever understood. He had been watching the same tree for 11 years before he understood what it was showing him. The tree stood at the edge of the clearing behind the main meditation hall at Wat Nong Pa Pong, a monastery in the dense forest of Ubon Ratchathani province in the northeast of Thailand, and Ajahn Chah had been sitting beneath it, or near it, or simply aware of it from the window of his kuti. Nearly every day since he had returned from wandering and settled in this particular stand of forest in 1954. It was a large tree. He did not know precisely how old. Its bark was deeply furrowed, a dark, reddish grey, and its roots spread along the surface of the ground for several meters in every direction before disappearing beneath the soil, making small hills and valleys in the earth that collected leaves and water and became, over time, the particular microhabitat of certain beetles and small frogs who appeared reliably after the monsoon rains. The tree's canopy was wide enough that on rainy days a person could stand beneath it and remain nearly dry. In the hot season, the shade it cast was the most reliably cool place in the entire monastery. Ajahn Chah was born on a June morning in 1918 inches, Bangor village in Ubon Ratchathani, the seventh child of subsistence rice farmers whose lives moved in the ancient rhythm of planting and harvest, of flood season and dry season, of the specific routines that keep a family fed on land that gives generously some years and withholds in others. He entered the monastery as a novice at the age of 9, as many Thai boys from farming families did, receiving education and a connection to the tradition that the village school could not offer, learned to read and write, studied the Pali chants, and lived the early monastery life with the cheerful competence of a naturally sociable child who had found the form agreeable. He disrobed in his early teens to help his family during a difficult agricultural period. He was reordained at 20, in April of 1939, in the formal ceremony of higher ordination that made him a bhikkhu, a fully ordained monk, and committed him, at least in intention, to the monastic life for the remainder of his years. His early years as a bhikkhu were spent in the conventional manner, studying the Buddhist scriptures, learning the Pali language with its precise technical vocabulary for states of mind and degrees of insight, performing the rituals and ceremonies that formed the backbone of Thai village Buddhism, doing his best to meditate according to the instructions he had received from teachers who were themselves doing their best with what they had been given. It was not enough. He understood everything he was taught, and he did not understand anything at all. The problem clarified itself sharply in 1946, when his father became ill and died within the span of a few weeks. Ajahn Chah sat with him through the illness with the attentiveness he brought to everything, and he felt, watching his father diminish and leave, the full weight of the central Buddhist teaching that everything which arises passes away, without exception, without negotiation, collide with his actual experience of that truth in a way that no amount of sutra study had prepared him for. He knew impermanence as a doctrine. He did not know it the way he now felt it, as the living texture of things, present in every breath his father drew and released, and eventually stopped drawing. The gap between what he knew and what he could live in was enormous, and he was aware of it continuously. He packed his alms bowl in his robes and left. He became a Tudong monk, a wandering ascetic, practicing in the Thai forest tradition, moving through the forests and cremation grounds in remote wilderness areas of northeast Thailand, sleeping under a protective net hung from a tree, rising before dawn, walking slowly for alms in whatever village was nearest, eating once and not again until the following morning. The forest tradition, as it had been revived in the early 20th century by the remarkable teacher Ajahn Mun, was explicitly oriented toward this kind of austere practice, not as self-punishment, but as the removal of distraction, the stripping away of everything that insulated the practitioner from direct encounter with what was actually happening in the mind. He walked for 7 years. He sat in forests where tigers moved at night. He could sometimes hear them. The particular crack of undergrowth that announced something large and unhurried, and in cremation grounds where the village dead were burned on open pyres, and where the smell of wood smoke and the contemplation of bones that had recently been. People gave the impermanence teachings a vividness that no lecture could replicate. He practiced with the breath, with the sensations of the body, with the contents of the mind as they arose and passed, in the specific way that extended hours of meditation in isolated places allowed them to be observed with unusual clarity. He met Ajahn Mun once, briefly, a single overnight, at a forest monastery in Sakon Nakhon province. Ajahn Mun was then in his late 70s, the most revered meditation master in Thailand, a small and precisely dignified man who had spent 50 years practicing and teaching in conditions of genuine austerity. He was not a demonstrative teacher. He did not give elaborate discourses. He observed. He asked occasionally penetrating questions. He said to Ajahn Chah, after their brief conversation, "This, although the teachings are extensive and detailed, at their heart, they are very simple. With mindfulness established, if you see that everything arises in the heart-mind, right there is the true path of practice." Ajahn Chah returned to his wandering with this single sentence working in him like a slow digestion. It was not new information. He had heard versions of it in dozens of forms. But hearing it from Ajahn Mun, in that particular moment of his practice, something shifted, not dramatically, not with the quality of a breakthrough, but the way a jigsaw piece shifts when you finally find the piece it has been waiting to be adjacent to. In 1954, after 7 years of wandering, he was invited to settle in a dense forest near his birth village. The forest was described to him as uninhabited and wild, full of cobras and wild boars and, according to the villagers, ghosts. He was pleased. He went. The monks who arrived to practice with him cleared a minimal amount of undergrowth, built simple huts from bamboo and palm leaf, established the basic structure of monastery life, the morning alms round into the nearby village, the shared meal before noon, the afternoon and evening sitting practice, the chanting that marked the day's beginning and end. The forest remained essentially itself. The cobras remained. The wild boars visited at night. The sounds of the surrounding jungle were always present through the bamboo walls of the meditation hall. Insects of particular variety and insistence. Frogs calling in the wet season. The distant call of birds at dawn that began before the sky showed any change and stopped. Suddenly, as though someone had drawn a curtain, when full light arrived. This was Wat Nong Pa Pong. It grew over the following decades into one of the most significant monastic communities in Southeast Asia, with more than 200 branch monasteries eventually established throughout Thailand and the world. But in those first years, it was simply a clearing in a dense forest, with a handful of monks, a particular tree at the edge of the meditation hall clearing, and a teacher who was still learning what he had come here to understand. The tree was the teaching. He did not understand this immediately. He understood it slowly. Across the 11 years, during which the tree was simply there, the same tree, going through the same cycle of seasons that the forest had been cycling through for longer than any human memory in the region could reach. In the cool, dry season, from November through February, the tree lost some of its leaves, not dramatically, not the spectacular stripping of northern temperate trees in autumn, but a gradual thinning, the canopy becoming slightly more permeable to light. In March and April, the hot season, the leaf cover thickened again with new growth. In the wet season, from May through October, the rains came in patterns that ranged from gentle afternoon showers to storms of remarkable intensity that bent the tree's upper branches and sent water sheeting off the canopy in curtains. Through all of it, the tree was the tree. It was not troubled by the rain. It did not resist the heat. It did not grieve the falling of its leaves or congratulate itself on their return. The storms moved through it, and the storms ended, and the tree continued doing what trees do, which is mostly nothing visible but continuous at every level, growing, circulating water upward from roots to canopy and releasing it back to the air, fixing carbon, supporting the specific beetle and frog community in its roots, casting shade in precise proportion to its canopy's density. The tree, Ajahn Chah began to understand, was the mind. Not the thoughts and feelings and sensations that move through the mind, those were the weather. The mind itself was the tree. Stable, rooted, capable of allowing everything that passed through it to pass through without being, at its core, other than what it was. He began teaching this to his students, not as a metaphor exactly, but as a direct instruction in how to sit. When you sit in meditation, he would say, thoughts will come, emotions will come. Some of them will feel urgent. Some of them will feel important. Some of them will feel like they are you, like they are what you are, rather than simply what is moving through you. They are weather. You are the sky. You are not the clouds. The clouds arise in you, move through you, and dissolve in you. But they are not you. You were sky before this thought arrived, and you will be sky after it leaves. Can you feel the difference between the thought and the awareness in which the thought is appearing? That awareness, that open, spacious quality that can hold anything that arises without being contracted or diminished by it. That is your actual nature, not the weather, the sky. He said it in dozens of ways over the decades. He said it with simple directness. Don't hang on to anything. Let go and surrender to the way things are. He said it with humor, which was one of his most characteristic modes. He had a laugh that his students described as entirely physical, involving his whole body, arriving suddenly and departing just as quickly, leaving the person it was directed at feeling gently illuminated rather than mocked. He said it with stories, which he told with the economy of a man who understood that the mind remembers narrative better than doctrine. One story he told often concerned a visiting scholar who arrived at Wat Nong Pa Pong after a long journey from Bangkok, carrying a briefcase of Buddhist texts and a notebook full of questions. The scholar sat with Ajahn Chah and asked his first question, which was lengthy and philosophically intricate, involving the relationship between Nibbana and the 5 aggregates. Ajahn Chah listened to the whole thing. Then he poured tea into the scholar's cup until it overflowed onto the mat between them. The scholar leapt back. Ajahn Chah said, "Your cup is already full. How can I put anything in it? Come back when you have emptied it. But the teaching he returned to most consistently, across 40 years of teaching at Wat Nong Pa Pong and in the branch monasteries and on visits to England and America and Australia, was simpler than any of these stories. It was this: you are not your mind. You never have been. You are what knows the mind. This is easy to say and takes most of a lifetime to actually receive in the body rather than the intellect. Because the fusion of identity with the contents of the mind is so complete, so seamless, that the idea of a distinction between the awareness and the contents seems initially like philosophy rather than experience. You feel sad, and it seems obvious that you are sad, not that sadness is moving through a spacious awareness that is itself not sad. You feel worried, and it seems obvious that worry is your condition, not that worry is a cloud and you are underneath the clouds, sky that has never not been sky. The fusion is so old and so total that the awareness that is prior to it can seem like an abstraction, a concept, a thing someone says rather than a thing one can actually inhabit. And yet, every person who has ever sat quietly for long enough in formal meditation or simply in the particular stillness that arrives sometimes at the end of a difficult day, or at the side of a body of water, or in the space between sleeping and waking has touched it. The quality of awareness that is present when thoughts are also present but have quieted slightly, when the narrative of self pauses for a breath, when the relentless categorization of experience into what I like and what I dislike relaxes momentarily. That quality open, mild, interested without grasping, present without needing the present moment to be otherwise, is the sky that the clouds pass through. It is not an achievement. It is the ground of experience. It was there first, before the first thought arrived, and it will remain when the last thought of this session passes. Ajahn Chah sat under his tree for 38 years before the strokes began in 1981, a series of them, leaving him initially with reduced speech, then with none, and eventually with a stillness of body to match the stillness of mind he had spent his life pointing at. For 10 years he lay in his kuti, unable to speak, while thousands of students came to sit in his presence, receiving in his silence a teaching that his words had only been attempting to approximate. He died in January of 1992, in the same forest monastery he had established nearly 4 decades before, in the sound of the night, insects, and the distant rain, and the particular quality of dark that a Thai forest achieves in the deep hours before dawn. The tree at the edge of the clearing is still there. Or a tree is there, perhaps the same one. Perhaps its descendant, rooted in the same soil. It does not concern itself with the distinction. If you keep a watch on your mind for your whole life, Ajahn Chah said once to a student who asked what the deepest teaching was, you will never be bored. And you will eventually discover something that every moment of genuine stillness has been trying to show you, that the one doing the watching is not troubled by what it watches, has never been troubled by it, has been, continuously, without effort, the sky in which all weather has always moved. The thoughts that are moving through you right now, the ones still reviewing the day, still holding the shape of whatever worried you, before you lay down, they are clouds, not you, moving through you, already beginning to thin. Feel the quality that remains when you stop attending to the clouds for a moment. Just that quality of open awareness, present and unhurried, the way a forest is present, not achieving anything, not becoming anything, simply here, in all it's rooted, breathing, ordinary, extraordinary completeness. Let the clouds move. Let the breath move. Let the body settle into the surface that holds it. You are the sky. You have always been the sky. And as the awareness opens a little wider, as the edges of the self dissolve slightly into the surrounding dark, the way the tree's outline dissolves into the forest, at nightfall, we move now to the mountains of ancient Korea, where an old scholar who had spent 50 years believing he understood everything was shown, in a single moment by a courtyard well, that he had not yet understood the most important thing of all. He had spent 44 years building a mind that could hold the entire sky of Buddhist philosophy, and it took a skull full of maggots to show him that the sky had always been holding him. Wonhyo was born in 672 CE in Apnyang village, in the Silla kingdom, one of the three kingdoms that then divided the Korean peninsula, each competing with the others for dominance in a centuries-long struggle that involved not only armies but alliances, marriages, and the careful cultivation of relationships with the Tang dynasty of China, which cast its cultural and military shadow across the entire region. Silla was the southeastern kingdom, its capital at Gyong-ho in a broad river valley ringed by gentle mountains, and it was, by the 7th century, the most thoroughly Buddhicized of the three kingdoms. The Dharma had penetrated not only the monasteries but the aristocratic families, the military class, and the royal court, where Buddhist monks served as advisors and Buddhist philosophy provided much of the intellectual language through which questions of governance and ethics were discussed. Into this world, Wonhyo was born to a family of the aristocratic class, the bone rank system of Silla, stratified society with meticulous precision, and his family's position gave him access to the education and the monastic connections that a less privileged birth would have foreclosed. He was intellectually extraordinary from the earliest age at which intellectual gifts can be distinguished from mere precocity. He absorbed texts with the particular ease of minds that are structured for this kind of work, not simply memorizing but understanding at the level of internal logic, tracing how arguments moved, where they depended on prior assumptions, where they arrived at conclusions that required the reader to hold several incompatible ideas in tension simultaneously. By his 30s, he was recognized across the Silla kingdom and beyond as the foremost Buddhist scholar of his generation. His commentaries on the major Mahayana sutras, the Nirvana Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Awakening of Faith, were circulated not only in Korea, but across to China and Japan, where they were studied and respected by scholars who had never met him and never would. He was very good at being Wonhyo, the scholar. This was both the greatest fact of his life and, for the first 44 years of it, the greatest obstacle to what he actually needed to discover. In the year 661, he decided to travel to China. He was 44 years old. He had read everything available to him in Korea, had corresponded with Chinese scholars, had exhausted the intellectual resources of the Silla tradition, and believed with the honest conviction of a serious practitioner rather than the vanity of an ambitious one that the great teachers and libraries of Tang China held something he had not yet found. His closest friend and fellow scholar, Uisang, was traveling with him. Uisang was 36, from a noble family, deeply learned, and genuinely good company across a long and difficult journey. They had been corresponding for years and had studied together for extended periods. And the relationship between them was the kind that forms between two people of comparable intelligence who have enough respect for each other to argue seriously and enough affection to stop arguing and simply be glad of each other's company when the argument has run its course. The route to China from the Silla capital of Gyong-ho took them north and west, through the territories that had recently been contested, ground in the wars between the three kingdoms, landscapes that carried the specific quality of land that has had armies move through it and has been slowly returning to itself. They traveled on foot, as scholars and monks traveled, with light packs and begging bowls, stopping at monasteries and farmhouses and occasionally in the open air when no shelter presented itself before nightfall. The late summer of 661 was warm and humid. The Korean summer pushes heat inland from the Yellow Sea and holds it against the mountains in a way that makes movement on foot more effortful than the same distance in cooler seasons. And they walked steadily rather than fast, covering the ground in the way of experienced travelers who understand that speed on the first day costs distance on the fifth. On the third evening of travel, a storm came in from the west without much warning, a wall of dark cloud that arrived quickly and opened into rain of genuine force before they had found shelter. They ran for whatever cover the landscape offered and found what appeared to be a cave or earthen shelter on a hillside above the road, dark, dry, large enough for two people to lie down in. They crawled in out of the rain. The storm continued for several hours, drumming on the hillside above them, running in rivulets past the entrance. They ate what they had in their packs, dried barley and a little pickled vegetables, and lay down to sleep in the dark, close together for warmth, listening to the rain slow and eventually stop. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, Wonhyo woke with a thirst that felt urgent and physical. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself in the dark. The shelter was very dark, no moon, the entrance barely distinguishable from the surrounding blackness. He extended his hand and groped around the floor of the shelter. His fingers touched something rounded and smooth and cool, a vessel of some kind, a bowl or a gourd. He lifted it carefully. There was liquid inside. He raised it to his lips. The water was cool and faintly sweet, and he drank it in deep swallows that satisfied his thirst completely. He set the vessel down, lay back, and slept until dawn with the particular quality of sleep that comes after thirst has been properly resolved. He woke to grey light coming through the entrance of the shelter. He sat up. He looked around. He looked at the vessel he had drunk from in the night. He looked at the floor of the shelter. He looked at the entrance, and at the hillside beyond it, in the morning light. The shelter was a tomb. Not an empty tomb, an ancient burial chamber. Its contents disturbed by time and weather and the action of animals over what was likely several centuries. Human bones lay scattered across the floor and the walls, and the vessel he had drunk from in the night, the smooth, rounded, the cool thing his hand had found in the dark, was a human skull, its interior filled with stagnant rainwater that had pooled through a crack in the earthen ceiling and been sitting for some time, developing the specific ecology of still water in a dark enclosed space, faint green growth, a shimmer of small insect larvae near the surface, the smell of organic decay that he had not detected in his thirst, and dark. He got up and went outside. He was sick for some time on the hillside in the early morning. U-isang, who had slept through the night undisturbed, came to find him when he did not return. They sat together on the hillside while Wonhyo recovered. And while he sat there in the morning light, with the tomb entrance visible behind them and the early sounds of birds beginning in the hillside vegetation, something was happening in him that was not quite thought, but was more organized than sensation. He was tracking it carefully, the way he tracked arguments in texts following the thread, noting where it led. Last night, in the dark, his hand had found a vessel, and his thirst had interpreted it as a gourd of fresh water. The water had tasted sweet. It had been fully satisfying. He had slept contentedly afterward. This morning, the same water, chemically identical to the water of last night, had produced nausea, disgust, the full physical response to something his mind now categorized as contaminated and wrong. Nothing had changed in the water between last night and this morning. Everything had changed in his knowledge of what the vessel was. The water itself was neither sweet nor disgusting. The water was water. The vessel was neither a gourd nor a skull. Both were human names for a curved, hollow object that held liquid. The quality that had made the water sweet last night and revolting this morning was not in the water. It was in the mind. In the interpretation, the mind placed upon sensory data before declaring the data to be either pleasant or unpleasant, clean or contaminated, worthy of the label gourd or worthy of the label skull. All phenomena arise from the mind. When the mind is clear, the skull and the gourd are not two. When the mind is conditioned, they become entirely separate things with entirely different moral weights and emotional valences, and the person holding the skull believes, completely and with the authority of immediate experience, that their response to it is simply correct. 44 years of scholarship had been moving toward this, not toward a new doctrine, toward a direct encounter with the thing all the doctrines had been pointing at, that the mind which categorizes is not the same as the awareness that is prior to categorization. That beneath every label water, skull, pure, contaminated, Menghyo, scholar, fool, there is something that simply knows, without the knowledge carrying the automatic weight of judgment, that this something had been present every night of his life, operating quietly beneath the elaborate architecture of his learning, and had never required a single text to function. He said to Yuasung, after a long silence on the hillside, "There is nothing to find in China. What I came here looking for is right here. I am going home." Yuasung was surprised. He tried to reason with his friend. They had come so far. The teachers in China were extraordinary. There was still so much to learn. Wonhyo listened to all of it with the patient affection of a man who has just seen something clearly and is not going to unsee it because the unseen position was more convenient. He said, "Everything arises in the mind. Why should I seek it somewhere else?" Yuasung continued to China. Ni turned and walked back to Silla. He walked back alone, in the early morning light, through the landscape that had carried armies and was now simply land, fields and hills, and the sound of birds and the weight of a pack on his back that had become lighter, somehow, than it had been on the way out. He returned to the Silla kingdom and did something that no one quite expected. Given the stature he had attained, he left the monastery. Not permanently, and not in rejection of the Dharma, he continued to write, and the commentaries he produced in the remaining 25 years of his life after the skull episode were among the most profound and enduring in the Korean Buddhist tradition. But he stopped presenting himself as a scholar, a monk, a respected authority in the hierarchy of institutional Buddhism. He began to move through the ordinary world, the markets and villages and taverns and street corners of Silla, in the way of a man who has nothing to protect. He composed songs with simple Buddhist themes and sang them at crossroads and in market squares, accompanying himself on a gourd-shaped lute. He ate with farmers and traders and the women who sold vegetables at the morning market. He called himself, with the self-deprecating accuracy of genuine humility, a layman of minor lineage. He visited places that respectable monks did not visit. He sat with people who had no philosophical vocabulary and no interest in acquiring one, and talked about the Dharma in whatever language they actually spoke. He was the greatest scholar in Korean Buddhist history, and he spent a quarter of his life singing songs in market squares. This is not a story about the uselessness of learning. The 44 years of scholarship were not wasted. They were the ground in which the skull's revelation could take root, precisely because the mind that encountered it was cultivated enough to follow the thread all the way to its conclusion. But the conclusion was not a doctrine. The conclusion was this, that the identity constructed through knowledge, the accumulation of credentials, understandings, position, interpretations, the self that knows itself primarily through what it knows is exactly as solid as a gourd in the dark. As long as you are certain of what the vessel is, the water tastes sweet. The moment the certainty lifts, the same water reveals itself to be something else entirely, and the awareness that can hold both the sweet water and the contaminated water, that can know the skull and the gourd simultaneously without needing to resolve them into one correct version. That awareness is not something you acquire through learning. It was there before the first text was opened. It will be there after the last label dissolves. There is a particular way of suffering that comes from being very attached to your identity as someone who understands things, who has it figured out, or mostly figured out, or at least more figured out than most, who has accumulated enough experience and reflection to have earned, it seems, the right to some settled sense of who they are and what they know. This identity, the one that knows, is perhaps the most seductive of all the identities the mind produces, because it feels like the conclusion of a genuine process, a reasonable reward for genuine effort. And it is also, Wonhyo's skull suggests, just another vessel in the dark. Sweet or nauseating, depending entirely on the light you look at it in. This is not an invitation to abandon what you know. It is an invitation to hold it a little more lightly, to notice that you are not your knowledge, that the awareness in which your understanding arises open, spacious, present, is not itself a thing you know. It is prior to knowing. It was there before the first insight arrived, and it will remain when the last certainty releases. Feel that now, if you can, not the accumulated knowledge of your life, but the awareness in which that knowledge sits, quiet, open, not requiring anything to be other than it is. The skull and the gourd, held in the same hand. Equally neither. Let your breath soften around that recognition. Let the body grow heavier, the way all bodies do in the small hours, when the mind finally agrees to stop reviewing its inventory and simply rest in what it actually is. You are not what you have understood. You are what is doing the understanding. And that's something open, present, never absent, needs nothing from this moment except to be allowed to be. If you drift now, drift completely. Sleep is not the end of wisdom. Sleep is wisdom resting in itself. And as the skull and the gourd dissolve into each other in the dark, and the mind releases its grip on which one it was holding, we travel now for our final story, from the ancient Korean hills to the banks of a wide river in Sri Lanka, where an old monk named Mahinda sat at the water's edge as the light left the sky, and stopped, for the first time in his long life, waiting for anything at all. He had crossed an ocean to write the greatest book ever composed on the path to freedom, and on the morning it was finished, he walked to the river's edge, sat down in the mud, and did not know what to do with his hands. His name meant voice of the Buddha. In the Pali language in which he thought and wrote and dreamed, the language of the earliest Buddhist texts, a language descended from the ancient dialects of northern India and carried southward through centuries of monastic transmission. Ghosa meant voice, and that was precisely what he had made himself into. A voice for the teaching. A container for the accumulated wisdom of 700 years of Theravada commentary, preserved in the monastery libraries of Sri Lanka in the ancient Sinhala language and at risk, he believed, of being lost as Buddhism in India contracted under the pressure of new philosophical schools that wrote in Sanskrit and drew students who might otherwise have sat with the Pali texts. He had come from India, from the Buddhaghosa region, where the Buddha himself had sat beneath the pipal tree and awakened crossing the narrow strait between the Indian subcontinent and the island of Lanka in a wooden boat that smelled of salt and bilge and the particular anxiety of open water, arriving at Anuradhapura with nothing except his memory, which was exceptional, and his intention, which was to translate the Sinhala commentaries into Pali and give the world a complete and authoritative guide to the path of purification. Anuradhapura was, in the 5th century of the Common Era, one of the great cities of the ancient Buddhist world. It had been the capital of Sri Lanka for over 1,000 years, sitting in the dry zone of the island's north, watered by a network of ancient irrigation tanks, man-made reservoirs of extraordinary scale, their embankments stretching for kilometers across the flat agricultural plain, their surfaces reflecting the enormous sky of the Sri Lankan interior. That particular quality of sky that forms in the dry season above open land. Blue, so deep it was almost violet in the late afternoon, marbled with the white of cloud moving in off the Indian Ocean to the west. The city's religious center was the Mahavihara, the great monastery, a complex of halls and shrines and meditation cells and library buildings that had been accumulating and expanding since the 3rd century BCE, when Mahinda, son of the Emperor Ashoka, had brought the Dharma to the island and established the first Sangha on Lankan soil. Buddhaghosa arrived at the Mahavihara and presented himself to the elder monks with a directness that was characteristic of him. He explained what he wanted: access to the Sinhala commentaries stored in the monastery's library, permission to translate them into Pali, and the time and space to do the work properly. The elder monks looked at him. He was young, perhaps 30, with the particular intensity of intellectually gifted people who have not yet learned to moderate the visibility of their own capacities. They were not dismissive. They were careful. They had seen ambitious young scholars before, and they knew that ambition, even when sincere, was not the same as qualification. They gave him a test. They presented him with 2 verses from one of the suttas brief, apparently simple, and asked him to elaborate on the doctrine embedded in them, to show, through the quality of his elaboration, whether he truly understood the teaching or merely the words. He went to his cell, which was small and spare in the manner of all Mahavihara cells, a sleeping mat, a writing surface, a clay oil lamp, a window without glass through which the night air moved with the smell of the flowering temple trees in the courtyard below, and he wrote. He wrote for weeks. What emerged was not an elaboration of 2 verses. What emerged was the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, a comprehensive, insystematic, exhaustive account of the entire Theravada path of practice, the purification of virtue, the purification of mind through concentration, the purification of understanding through insight, stage by stage and layer by layer, from the first decision to practice all the way to the final dissolution of the illusion of a separate self that the tradition called Nibbana. It was 3 volumes. It drew on every significant text in the canon. It organized material that had been scattered across hundreds of suttas and commentaries into a coherent sequence that a practitioner could follow like a map through difficult country. He brought it to the elder monks. They read it. They looked at each other. They gave him access to the full library. He spent the following years at the Mahavihara, working through the library with the methodical intensity of a man who has been given permission to do the one thing he was built for. The library rooms smelled of palm leaf manuscripts and the particular dry dustiness that old texts develop in tropical climates, a slightly sweet, slightly musty smell. The smell of knowledge held in organic material that is slowly returning to the earth from which it came. The monks who preserved the manuscripts kept them in wooden boxes lined with cloth, rotating them periodically to prevent the humidity damage that destroyed so many texts across South Asia in those centuries. Buddhaghosa worked from dawn to the midday meal, and after the meal rest, he worked again until the lamp oil ran low and the night sounds outside his window, the call of lizards, the distant drumming of the village temples at festival time. The song of insects, so continuous and varied, it became a kind of silence, told him it was time to stop. He had a habit, in those working years, of sitting each evening at the edge of the great tank on the south side of Anuradhapura, the Tisawewa, one of the oldest reservoirs on the island. Its embankment wide enough to walk along, and its surface wide enough that the far shore was a dark line barely distinguishable from the evening sky. He would walk there after the oil lamp was extinguished and sit at the water's edge and look at the water while the light failed. It was not exactly meditation, or rather, it was not the formal structured meditation he wrote about with such precision. The careful progression through the stages of concentration, the systematic examination of sense objects, the controlled cultivation of insight into the three characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and non-self. It was simply sitting, looking at water, letting the day settle. He had an old student at the monastery, not a student of his. Exactly, but a monk he spoke with frequently, a Sri Lankan elder named Revata, who had been at the Mahavihara for 40 years, and whose understanding of the practical texture of the path had a quality quite different from scholarly understanding. Where Buddhaghosa understood the path analytically, could map every stage, cite every relevant passage, explain every nuance of doctrine with the precision of someone who has processed an extraordinary amount of material. Revata understood it the way a farmer understands soil, from the inside, from long acquaintance, from having worked it in every season and learned its properties through the particular intelligence of sustained contact. Revata was the one who told Buddhaghosa, early in his time at the Mahavihara, that the texts were not the practice. Buddhaghosa heard this and thought he understood it. He wrote about it. In fact, in the Visuddhimagga, the elegant formulation that the words of the teaching are a raft to carry the practitioner across the river of suffering, not a destination in themselves. He wrote this and believed it intellectually and continued to do what he always had, absorb text. The Visuddhimagga was completed sometime in the reign of King Mahanama, who ruled Anuradhapura in the early 5th century. The precise year is uncertain. The chronicles are careful about the king's name, but loose about the year. But the morning it was done was an ordinary morning, unremarkable from the outside. Buddhaghosa brought the final section to the scriptorium, where the monks who would copy it were waiting, and he set it down on the table, and he thanked them, and he left. He walked through the monastery grounds to the south gate and out along the tank embankment and sat down at the water's edge. The tank was full. It was the end of the wet season. The great rains had come and gone. The embankment had been tested and held, and the surface of the water was still and mirror-flat in the morning air, reflecting the pale sky above it with a precision that made it impossible to say where the water ended and the sky began. He sat there for a long time and did not know what to do with his hands. They were used to a pen, a stylus, the physical act of inscribing thought onto palm leaf. Without the work, They lay on his knees with a slightly lost quality, as though they had forgotten what they were for. He had written the most complete guide to the path of purification that had ever been composed in any language. He had done what he came here to do. He had spent perhaps 15 years at this task, and sitting at the water's edge on this particular morning, he felt not satisfaction but a quality of emptiness that was distinct from sadness, distinct from completion, distinct from anything he had a name for. Old Rivata found him there. Eventually, as he had found him there many evenings over the years, he sat down beside him without asking why Buddhaghosa was sitting at the tank at this hour of the morning. They looked at the water together. After a long silence, Rivata said, "You have finished." Buddhaghosa said, "Yes." Another silence. A heron landed on the far bank, the particular heron, or one of the particular herons that frequented that stretch of embankment. A long-legged grey-blue bird of extraordinary stillness, standing at the margin of the water and looking into it with the concentrated attention of an expert. Rivata said, "And now what?" Buddhaghosa said, "I don't know." Rivata was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. You have been the voice of the Buddha for 15 years. The voice is useful, but it is not the Buddha. What is left? When the voice stops?" Buddhaghosa looked at the tank. The heron looked at the water. The water reflected everything presented to its sky. Heron, embankment, the moving clouds without preference and without resistance, as accurately when the image was beautiful as when it was plain, without holding any of it and without refusing any of it. It simply received. It simply reflected. It was not diminished by the receiving or the reflecting. It was, in the interval between each image that passed across it, simply what it was: water, open, still, itself. Rivata said, "The path you have described in such detail, do you know where it leads?" Buddhaghosa said, "To the cessation of the illusion of a separate self." Rivata said, "Then what is doing the knowing right now?" Buddhaghosa sat with this, not as a philosophical puzzle, but as an actual question addressed to his actual experience in this actual moment: the grass under his hands, the smell of the tank in the morning air, the heron on the far bank, the stillness of the water, and whatever was present in all of it that was doing the perceiving. He traced the question carefully inward, the way he traced an argument in a text, following it through each stage until he reached the point where it stopped. The point where the question could not be asked any further because there was no longer a questioner standing at a distance from the answer. There was simply this: knowing, without a center, without an edge, without a name. He did not say anything for a long time. The heron eventually lifted from its place on the far bank and flew north along the tank, its wings moving in that heavy, unhurried way of large birds that have committed fully to the air. The morning brightened. The monks in the distant buildings of the Mahavihara began the day's work, the sound of sweeping, the distant chanting of the dawn puja, the wooden percussion of the breakfast bell. Then Rivata said, very quietly, "The book is complete. Now leave it on the bank and step into the water." Buddhaghosa understood, not abstractly in the marrow. The book was the raft. The raft had brought him to the shore. The shore was not the other side. This was the shore. This morning, this tank, this still water reflecting the sky, this awareness that was knowing all of it without needing to be otherwise. He had built a great structure to point at freedom. The structure was accurate and beautiful and necessary, and freedom itself was not in the structure. It had never been in the structure. It was here, in this grass, in this body sitting at this water's edge, in whatever was doing the knowing before the knowledge arrived, and after it had gone, and in the spacious middle where knowledge came and went without leaving a mark. The Visuddhimagga is still studied in Theravada monasteries around the world today. It is still, 1500 years after its composition, the most comprehensive, systematic guide to the Theravada path that exists in any language. It has shaped how hundreds of millions of people understand practice and wisdom and the possibility of freedom. And in the postscript, he wrote at its conclusion, Buddhaghosa expressed the hope that the merit of this work would lead him to be reborn in the presence of the next Buddha, Metteya, and hear the teaching, and then only then attain enlightenment. He had written the entire guide to liberation and did not yet trust that it pointed at something available right now. Not after the next rebirth, not in the presence of the next Buddha. Now, at the water's edge, in whatever is doing the knowing before the knowing can be named. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about the particular courage it takes, after building something, to let what you built carry you to the bank and step out of it. To discover that the map was perfect and the territory was not the map. To arrive at the moment that every structure of understanding points toward but cannot contain, the moment when the one who understands stops being the one who understands, and is simply this, knowing, open, reflected in still water like a sky. You have been building your understanding for as long as you have been alive. Every experience added something. Every difficulty refined something. Every year of showing up and paying attention and trying to live with more honesty than you managed the year before, all of it was the structure. And the structure has been real. It has held you. It has carried you this far. And what it has been pointing toward, what every genuine effort at understanding has always been gesturing at, is not more understanding. It is the place beneath understanding where the knowing happens, open and unhurried, needing nothing from this moment except to be present in it. Feel that now. Not the knowledge. The knowing, the quiet, open, unhurried awareness that is here before any thought arrives, and here after each thought departs. The water of the tank, reflecting everything without holding anything. Let the breath come. Let it go. The heron lifts and flies, and the water closes behind its reflection as though nothing passed, as though the sky was always this whole, as though there was never anything that needed to be otherwise. Softer now. The day is nearly done. The structure can rest. And as the knowing settles into itself, as the breath deepens and the body grows heavier and the water becomes indistinguishable from the sky above it, we move now into our last story, the one that will carry you all the way down, not to understanding, to rest, to the place where there is no longer anything to carry, no longer any distance to travel, no longer any shore to reach. Only this darkness, this breath, this dissolving, only this. The river did not know his name, and this, he had finally decided, was the best thing about it. Yu Tun had farmed the same 3 acres of paddy land beside the Irrawaddy for 61 years. He had planted and harvested in those years more times than he could count without effort, and he had stopped counting without effort some decades ago. The land was in the floodplain of the river, which meant that in the monsoon months from May through October, roughly, depending on the year, the water rose and the paddies were flooded in the particular productive way of river delta land. The silt laid down by each flood season enriching the soil for the next planting. The water receding in October to leave behind that specific dark smell of wet earth and fertility that Yu Tun associated with the beginning of the good months. The growing months, the months when the green shoots pushed up through the mud and the egrets came to stand in the paddies and the air in the mornings was clean and cool. He was 81 years old. He had been a lay Buddhist practitioner since the age of 7, when his mother had first brought him to the monastery in the nearby village and introduced him to the abbot, a small and patient man who had been teaching the village children the 5 precepts and the basics of metta, practice loving-kindness meditation for 40 years without particular drama or ambition, simply because it was what needed doing and he was the one available to do it. Yu Tun had taken to the practice the way he took to everything involving attention, seriously, steadily, without requiring it to be glamorous. He had not become a great practitioner. He had not attained any stage of awakening that he was aware of, had not experienced the luminous openings that the meditation manuals described, had not become transparent to impermanence in any decisive or final way. He had simply practiced. Mornings, when the work allowed, which was most mornings, because a rice farmer's work, while unrelenting, has its rhythms, and the hour before breakfast was almost always available. He sat on the wooden platform outside the house that faced east, wrapped in a cotton longyi in the cool morning air, watching the light develop over the river while his breath moved in and out and his mind moved through its ordinary inventory of plans and memories and worries and returned. Each time it wandered to the breath. 61 years of this. The breath and the river and the returning. His wife Dormo had died 3 years ago. In the hot season, from a fever that came and left within a week and took her in the leaving. She had been a practical woman who kept the household accounts in a small notebook with green covers and made the best mohinga in the village, and who had, across 60 years of marriage, managed to love him with a specificity and patience that he understood only retrospectively as the most extraordinary act of sustained attention he had ever witnessed. He missed her the way he missed the presence of the monsoon in the dry season, not acutely, not as a wound that opened and bled, but as an ambient absence, a quality of the world having fewer sounds in it than before. The children were elsewhere. 3 children, all grown, all in Yangon now, in the way of rural children who have found work in the city and cannot afford to come back often. They called when they could. He did not reproach them. This was how it went. He had left his own parents' village, once, for a different reason, and had not been able to stay. He lived alone in the house beside the paddy field. His neighbor, an old woman named Ma Kin, brought him rice and soup 3 times a week and checked that he was not dead, a service she performed with the matter-of-fact affection of someone who has decided that another person's survival is simply her business and has stopped needing thanks for it. He was grateful anyway. The evening routine had not changed in many years. After the afternoon rest, he sat outside and watched the river until the light was gone. The Irrawaddy moved south past his farm on its way to the Delta and the Andaman Sea, a wide river in this stretch of the plain, perhaps a kilometer across at normal water levels, brown with silt in the rainy season and a deeper, cleaner brown in the dry season, carrying always on its surface the accumulated evidence of everything upriver. The logs from the teak forests of the north, the plastic bags and coconut husks of the towns, the occasional upturned boat weathered past recognition, the fishermen in their narrow vessels moving in the particular slow way of people who have been doing the same thing long enough to have stopped hurrying. This evening, the light was exceptional. It had been a clear day in the dry season, January, perhaps, or early February. One of those days when the air held almost no moisture and the sky above the Irrawaddy Valley was the particular blue that has nothing behind it. A blue that seems to go on past the visible into something the eye cannot follow. The sun was setting now, moving toward the hills on the western bank, and the river was holding the sunset in a way that rivers hold light when the water is still enough, not reflecting it exactly, more absorbing it, taking the orange and the rose and the deepening copper into its surface and giving them back changed, warmer, more interior. The egrets that had been fishing the shallows all afternoon were lifting into the air in ones and twos, their white bodies catching the last light and holding it as they moved toward the roost trees on the far bank in the unhurried way of birds that have done this flight every evening for their entire lives. Yu Tun watched them go. His breathing was slow. His hands were in his lap, palms open, the way they opened without his deciding when he sat like this. When the evening was like this, he had been thinking, earlier in the day, about his life. Not reviewing it exactly, he was past the age of comprehensive review, but touching it at various points, the way you touch a wall as you walk past it in the dark, just to know where you are. He had touched the paddy field at age 14 when his father first let him manage a row by himself. He had touched the afternoon he met Dormo at the New Year Water Festival, when she had poured water on his head with considerably more aim than strictly required and then walked away without looking back, which he had understood correctly as an invitation. He had touched the monsoon of 1988, when the river had flooded beyond its banks and taken the year's crop and most of the storage shed. And he had sat in this same spot on higher ground and watched the brown water cover his fields and had felt something he could not name, then a quality of acceptance that was not resignation, a way of holding the loss that did not require the loss to be otherwise. He had not thought of it as wisdom. Then, it had simply been the only available response. The water had come, and the water would go, and in between, there was nothing to do except wait, and feeding his family while they waited, and not adding his own distress to the already considerable distress of the situation. The water had gone. The field had recovered. He had planted again. He was still sitting in the same spot, 60 years after the flood, watching the river that had taken his harvest and returned it and taken it again in every cycle of rain and drought and recovery that a farming life moves through. The river did not know his name. It did not know his loss or his patience or the 60 years of mornings on the platform with his breath and the developing light. It moved south simply because south was where the land went, carrying everything it collected without preference, releasing everything at the delta without ceremony. It had been doing this since before any human memory on these banks could reach, and it would be doing it after the last memory had dissolved. He was not afraid of that. Not tonight. He had been afraid of it once, of the dissolving, of the ending, of the thing the texts called anicca, impermanence, that had seemed in his younger years like a verdict rather than a description. When he was young and strong and the field was full of crop and Dormo was alive and the children were still in the house. Impermanence had been something he understood doctrinally and avoided personally, the way you understand that winter comes and avoid. Nonetheless, dwelling on it in the warmth of summer, now it simply seemed like the river, going south, carrying everything, letting go at the delta. The light on the water was nearly gone. The egrets were settled in their roost trees, visible as white shapes against the darker shapes of the foliage on the far bank. The first stars were appearing above the eastern hills, not the bright stars that came later, but the tentative first stars, faint as suggestions, barely distinguishable from the remaining twilight. A dog barked somewhere in the village behind him. 2 short barks, and then nothing. Somewhere on the river, a boat engine moved quietly in the dark, its sound arriving across the water without urgency. He breathed. The air was cool now, the temperature dropping with the light, the way it drops on clear dry season evenings in this part of the delta, quickly, decisively, without the gradual cooling of cloudy nights. He could feel it on his hands, in his lap, and on his face. The specific quality of cool air moving across skin that has been in the sun all day. That slight tingling that is not discomfort. His feet on the wooden platform, the rough grain of the wood under his palms, the weight of his body against the low backrest he had built himself 40 years ago from teak offcuts and never replaced because it had proven adequate to every evening since. He was not thinking, or rather, the mind was doing what minds do in the late evening, when the body is tired and the light is gone, and there is nothing left requiring a decision. It was moving quietly, the way the river moved, carrying its small contents without urgency, releasing them without drama. A face appeared and was gone. The smell of the morning meal, the sound of Dormo's voice saying his name in the particular way she had said it, the flat short vowel of the Burmese, familiar as his own breathing. Gone. The feel of wet paddy soil under bare feet in the planting season. Gone. Everything arriving and going. The river carrying and releasing. No difference. Finally, between the water and the light on the water, and the eyes that had watched them both for 81 years, and the awareness in which all of it was happening, which had no name and no age and no attachment to either the arriving or the leaving. He did not know if this was wisdom. He suspected it was simply what happened when you were 81 and had spent 61 years sitting with your breath in the morning and watching the river in the evening and doing the work the land required and eating what was offered and releasing what was taken. Not a method. Exactly. More like the way a river knows how to move, not because it has decided to, but because the land tilts that way and the water follows. He was very tired. Not the tiredness of difficulty of the monsoon flood, or the grief, or the long years of physical labor, all of which had been a different kind of tired. This was the tiredness of completion, the tiredness of a day that has been fully inhabited, of an evening that has taken the last light and given it back to the river, and the river to the dark, and the dark to the stars that were now fully present above the eastern hills. Bright and cold and completely indifferent to the small warm creature sitting on a wooden platform below them and breathing. He did not need to understand anything more tonight. The river moved south. The stars held their positions, or appeared to. The dog in the village was quiet now. The boat engine on the river had passed beyond hearing. The air on his face was cool and present and asking nothing of him. He let his eyes close. The darkness behind his eyes was the same darkness as the darkness over the river, over the paddy field, over the far bank where the egrets were sleeping in their roost trees. No boundary between the darkness in here and the darkness out there. Just darkness. Just this. The breath still moving of its own accord. The body still warm. The wooden platform still solid beneath him. And underneath all of it, the river still going south. Carrying everything. Releasing everything. Moving in the only direction it had ever moved, which was away from what was and toward what comes next. Neither rushing nor resisting, neither arriving nor departing, simply flowing, simply this, simply the endless patient movement of water through the world it has been moving through since before anyone was watching. Sleep came the way the river moved, without announcement, without drama, simply arriving, as everything arrives, and taking him as everything eventually takes what it finds resting at its bank, gently, completely, and without asking his permission, which was, he would have said, if he had still been awake to say it, the best thing about it. Tonight, we traveled very far together, from the mountain hermitages of Korea, where a young monk named Gyong-ho sat in the mud of a plague-struck road and discovered that 10,000 pages of scripture had not yet taught him how to live, to the plains of ancient India, where Anatha Pindika lay dying with open hands and understood, finally, that 40 years of open-handed giving had been the practice all along, to the mist-filled mountains of Tang Dynasty, China, where a river stone showed Mazu Daoyi that the mind he had been trying to polish into a mirror was already, perfectly, itself, to the cedars of Aiheiji in winter Japan, where Dogen watched flowers fall and weeds grow and understood that the pain was never in the falling, only in the insistence that things should not fall, to the bamboo forests of Vietnam, where a king walked up a mountain in the rain and discovered that the lotus does not struggle with the mud it rises from, to the high cold passes of Tibet, where a pair of calused buttocks was the most honest teaching ever given, to the great teak forest of Thailand, where an old teacher sat under the same tree for decades and learned what the tree already knew, that the sky does not struggle with the clouds that move through it, to the hills of ancient Korea again, where Wonhyo drank from a skull in the dark and heard, in his own nausea, the most direct teaching the universe has ever given about the nature of mind, to the still water of Anuradhapura, where a man named Voice of the Buddha wrote the greatest guide to freedom ever composed, and then sat at the river's edge and did not know what to do with his hands. And finally, here, to the banks of the Irrawaddy at dusk, where an old rice farmer named Yu Tun closed his eyes and let the river take him. What have all of these people given us tonight? Not information. Something quieter than that. The recognition that the wisdom we have been searching for is not absent. It was present in the mud and the skull and the stone and the calused hands and the still water. It has been present in every difficult season of your own life, growing in the dark, the way all roots grow, not toward the light, but through whatever the earth offers, patiently, without drama, without needing to be acknowledged. You don't need to remember any of the names or the stories or the teachings. Let them dissolve now, the way the incense smoke dissolves at the ceiling of the monastery. Not gone, exactly, but no longer requiring you to hold them. I want to say something personal for a moment. I make this channel because I believe genuinely that wisdom belongs to everyone, not just to scholars or monastics, or people who have the right books on their shelves. I believe that the people who drove Gyong-ho to his practice were not philosophers, they were farmers who died in a flood year. That the people Anatha Pindika fed with thin rice gruel were not seeking enlightenment, they were simply hungry. That Yu Tun, on his wooden platform, understood something that no amount of reading could have given him, because it came from 61 years of showing up to his field and his breath and his river. Wisdom lives in ordinary lives. In people like you, listening at whatever hour this finds you, in whatever room you are in tonight. That is why I make this. And that is why, if these stories found something in you tonight, I am genuinely glad. If this channel is finding you something worth carrying into tomorrow, please consider subscribing. It helps more people find their way here. And every person who arrives at this channel in the middle of a hard night matters to me. Genuinely. Now, the stories have been told. The journey is complete, and Yu Tun's river is still moving south in the dark. carrying everything, releasing everything, asking nothing. You are enough exactly as you have been. You are wiser than you know. You are, right now, in this body, in this bed, in this room, the elder you have been waiting to become. The breath will continue on its own. The night will hold you. Good night.